Okay. My name is Eitan Azani. I will chair this panel about the ISIS. We are ready to start. And before we start our panel, what I want my assistant, everything is okay? I want my assistant to have the bio of the people that are working, are lecturing here. And then we will start the different topics regarding IS or DAS. You decide. When I started with I want to say ICT, always. And then we will continue with the story of how it was developed and what are the topics that connected to the IS. Please.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm honored to introduce this morning's panel, which includes Professor Eyal Zisser, Dr. Jonathan Spire, Mr. Shiraz Maher, Mr. Emile Simpson, Mr. Yoram Schweitzer, and of course our chair, Dr. Eitan Azani. Professor Eyal Zisser is the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies at Tel Aviv University. Professor Zisser has written extensively on the history and the modern politics of Syria and Lebanon, as well as the Arab-Israeli conflict. Among his books, Assad's Syria at a Crossroads, Lebanon, The Challenge of Independence, Faces of Syria, Commanding Syria, Bashar al-Assad's First Years in Power, and The Bleeding Cedar. Professor Zisser received his PhD from Tel Aviv University. He was a visiting professor in Cornell University and a visiting research fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Welcome. Dr. Jonathan Spire is a senior research fellow at the Global Research and International Affairs Center in Herzliya and a fellow at the Middle East Forum. He is the author of The Transforming Fire, The Rise of the Israel-Islamist Conflict, and a columnist at the Jerusalem Post. Dr. Spire holds a PhD in International Relations from the London School of Economics and a master's degree in Middle East Politics from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Shiraz Maher is a senior research fellow and head of outreach at the International Center for the Study of Radicalisation at King's College London. He is currently writing an intellectual history of al-Qaeda, exploring the development of the global jihad movement's political philosophy. Mr. Maher is also a journalist and foreign correspondent reporting on the Middle East, South Asia, and other terrorism matters. Most recently, he reported on the Egyptian uprising from Tahrir Square, where he spent time with revolutionaries trying to overthrow Hosni Mubarak. Mr. Maher holds degrees in history from the University of Leeds and Cambridge University. Emile Simpson is an Ernest May Fellow in History and Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government in the International Security Program. Mr. Simpson served in the British Army as an infantry officer in the Royal Gurkha Rifles until 2012 and completed 3 tours in southern Afghanistan, as well as service in Brunei, Nepal, and the Falkland Islands. He previously read ancient and modern history at Oxford University and subsequently returned as a visiting defense fellow to the Oxford Changing Character of War program. He also holds a graduate diploma in English law and is the author of War from the Ground Up, 21st Century Combat as Politics, and is also a columnist at Foreign Policy. He is currently working on the concept of the enemy in international law from a historical perspective. Yoram Schweitzer is a senior research fellow and head of the program on terrorism and low-intensity conflict at INSS, the Institute for National Security Studies here at Tel Aviv University. He served in military intelligence as head of the International Terror Section and in the Prime Minister's office as a member of the task force on locating missing soldiers and prisoners of war. After his retirement from the IDF, he served as an advisor to the Prime Minister's office and the Ministry of Defense. He is the author of Globalization of Terror, The Challenge of al-Qaeda, and the Response of the International Community, as well as al-Qaeda and the Internationalization of Suicide Terrorism and Female Suicide Bombers, Dying for Equality, ? And finally, our chair today, Dr. Azani, who currently serves as the Deputy Executive Director of the Institute for Counter-Terrorism. and he is Colonel Reserves in the IDF with operational research and academic experience in counterterrorism in the regional and international arenas. He is also a lecturer at the IDC, my professor, and additional institutions both in Israel and abroad. Dr. Azani advises both private and government entities on counterterrorism issues and testifies on the subject of Hezbollah in front of the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on International Affairs as well as in front of the European Parliament. Dr. Azani obtained his BA from Bar Ilan University, his MA from Tel Aviv University, and his PhD dissertation was on the development of revolutionary Islamic movements, a case study of Hezbollah. He is the author of Hezbollah, the story of the Party of God, from revolution to institutionalization, as well as many other scholarly articles. Please welcome our panel.
Thank you very much, Tamar, and I want to start our discussions regarding the Islamic Caliphate. I see here some of my students who are really very brave after hearing me 3 semesters to come to another topics that connect to ISIS. And what we are going to do is, it will be the order of this presentation. We'll start with Professor Eyal Zisser regarding the general description of the big picture in the Middle East that connected to ISIS. We continue with Dr. Jonathan Speyer that described the ISIS and the broader context of the Sunnite-Shiite war. We continue afterwards with Mr. Shiraz Maher that will discuss the influence of ISIS foreign fighters that have and will have on Europe. Then we continue with Emile. Simpson is here. I don't see him. Maybe he was captured by ISIS. I hope that we will find it. I hope that we will find him later in the, and he will describe the strategic reactions of, to ISIS by the West. We will continue with Mr. Yoram Schweitzer that will describe the threat to Israel. And we close the session in summaries of the evaluation and evolutions of ISIS that I will try to describe here. And then if we will be, we will have time and it will still survive, we'll have a question and answer. Thank you very much. Please.
Good morning and thank you. I thought I should focus on Syria. There should be even a map, right? To remind us what Syria used to be. And the connection is quite clear. This is an old map, not really updated from last year, to show you the course of events and how dramatic were the changes. I mean, in the link between the decline and the collapse of the Syrian state and the emergence to power of ISIS is quite clear. Actually, it's more direct than you can think, because if you think about it, the one who was behind, well, not directly behind, in Arabic we say kadamat asilat, help, support, sometimes by ignoring the emergence of al-Qaeda in Iraq, was Bashar al-Assad. But in 2003, it was not terrorism, it was resistance, mukawama to the American occupation. So Bashar al-Assad made this terrible mistake of supporting those radicals, and eventually they seized the opportunity and turned against him. But clearly we speak here about the collapse, the decline of the states here. In the case of Iraq, it was not necessarily the decline and the collapse of the state, it was the destruction of the state's institutions by the Americans after invading Iraq, and when facing the dilemma whether to leave the system untouched, the army, the state institution, they decided to destroy, eliminate, to build it from, reconstruct Iraq, and the result was the lack of any system. In the case of Syria, we speak about the decline, but the system is still there. No doubt about it. The fact that the system, the Syrian system, I'm not speaking only about the Alawites, the Syrian army, the Bashar al-Assad in person, but the fact that the system is still functioning and there is still, at least in some parts of Syria, a Syrian state, Syrian government, Syrian identity, linked not only to the Alawites, but to many Sunnis. That's what actually helped the regime to survive. But what used to be Syria, what used to be civil war, the Syrian revolution, because clearly it's not anymore the case. Let me remind us what happened in Syria since 2011 that brought us to this point where ISIS is challenging not only Iraq, but clearly also Syria and the entire Middle East. It all started in March 2011, and we can speak of, I would say, mainly 4 phases, mainly 4 stages. The first one was the peaceful, relatively peaceful protest, mainly in the periphery, the early months of 2011. And what happened in Syria actually was similar to what happened in Egypt. Young protesters in Syria, mainly in the periphery, mainly peasants, who got out to the streets and protested in demand for, well, actually it was not even getting rid of the regime, but mainly more justice, more freedom. But eventually, maybe it was unavoidable, maybe it was a clear result of the decision of the regime to strike back and use the army and to suppress brutally this peaceful protest. The result was that from limited protest, mainly in the periphery, mainly in places like Dara, where it all started, or in the north, it spread to all over Syria, and there was a change in the nature of the protest, not anymore peaceful protest, but instead of protesters in the streets, armed groups that organized locally in many cities and villages, and we moved to the new stage, popular uprising, wide uprising, violent, people start to be killed in not only during Friday or the weekend, but during the entire week and by hundreds. And then we move to the well-known civil war, which was spread all over Syria. The regime lost much of the control he had over the country, and that's where we were, let's say, a year ago. And what we said about the war and the civil war, no real change, nothing will happen. It can continue like that, like what we witness now in Somalia or Libya for years. It's a bloody tie. Nobody can decide the battle. The problem with the rebels is clearly that there is no any unity among the ranks. They fight local wars and local battles, and they can't decide this way. And no real military command, no real political command. They can't decide the battle. It can continue for some time. On the other hand, the regime managed to survive, is not strong enough to suppress the revolt, but he can survive clearly in Damascus, and that's what brought us to the conclusion that it can continue for some time. What happened during the last year? On the one hand, there was some achievements gained by the regime, mainly with the help of Hezbollah, Homs, Qusair in the region of Damascus. We all heard about it, speculated about it. Maybe this is the beginning of a change, but it mainly helped Bashar to survive and to secure his position in those parts of Syria which are still under his control, Damascus, Homs. I don't know if it does it works, but Damascus, Homs, clearly the Alawite region, the Syrian coast. But with the passing of time, we saw that still the regime is far from deciding the war. The support of Hezbollah came with a decision made by the regime, maybe not made in a public way, in a clear way, to launch what I would call a war of annihilation. I mean, because what the regime did was not only to try and fight those rebels, those armed groups, but also to take care of the population, civil population that support these rebels, that provide them with shelter. And this can explain us, first of all, the brutality, the use of chemical weapon, the use of advanced missiles, and the big number of not only casualties, but 6 million people, 1/3 of the population was forced to find shelter in neighboring countries or in other regions in Syria. The regime simply decided the best way to take control of a certain region is to clean it entirely from the civilian population. This led to clearly radicalization, brutalization. So this was one phenomenon. The other phenomenon was the kidnapping of the revolution. It was not anymore those young protesters who had nothing to do with Islam, with Islamic slogans, but slowly, but surely, radical Islamic groups took over all over Syria. It's a general phenomenon, and we heard no more about the Syrian Free Army. It's still there, about the secular groups which led the protest, the revolution, the war till that point, but instead we heard more and more about Islamic radical group, Islamization and radicalization of the war, the appearance of ISIS and then Nusra, but radicalization, Islamization also within the ranks of the Syrian, local Syrian groups all over Syria, Islamic Front, Jaish al-Islam, some with the idea of turning Syria into an Islamic state, some with the idea of turning the entire Middle East into an Islamic state, actually bringing this Syrian national identity and the story of the Syrian territorial state into an hand. And then, once again, a Thai, brutal, violent war, bloody Thai. Then we witnessed the appearance of ISIS, the dramatic achievements, and here I would like to end by making the two important comments. First of all, as for the regime, he managed to survive, but no doubt about it, he is bleeding. The battle over Quneitra show you how weak he is. He spread all of his forces all over Syria. He can't even send the 100, 200 soldiers which are needed to take over Quneitra. If you follow the reports in Al Jazeera, other places, I mean, the number of those rebels who are fighting in Quneitra are not more than several hundreds. And still the Syrian army have no enough manpower to capture it, to take it back. And this shows you how weak he is. He's bleeding. He's more relying not only on Hezbollah, but also volunteers from within the Alawite community. And there is a big question for how long such a bleeding regime can survive such deep and popular revolt against it. I start wondering. I mean, for some time I was sure that he's secure, he can survive forever. Now I'm start questioning the future survival of the regime, taking into consideration this effect, the bleeding, and the fact that he couldn't decide the battle even in areas which were captured by him with the help of Hezbollah. There is still the presence of the rebels, Kalamoun, Qusair, and others. And then ISIS. What is unique here, and with this I will bring my short introductory comments to hand. What is unique here is first, for the first time, I mean, if you look at Quneitra, the rebels are fighting the army. Who are the rebels? We can speak about 5, 6, 7 different groups. They all join forces on this tactical matter of fighting the army position in Quneitra or Aleppo, but these are still 7, 6, 5 separate groups with different identity, and when they don't fight the regime, they fight each other. this was the picture all over Syria. This is not anymore the picture. Whenever ISIS is taking control, it's ISIS, no one else. And this is very significant because for the first time we see here a group that can offer alternative in the sense that it's not anymore a bunch of gangs which are fighting the regime, but a cohesive organization that is taking over by forcing, by brutal methods sometimes, all other groups to join him, or either they face annihilation. The other thing is, in all places took over by the rebels, there was some sort of local governing, but very primitive. But clearly in most places, still the regime was still present, in the sense that the regime continued to pay salaries, the infrastructure, things that had to do with education and municipal services, the regime was still there. The rebels were not united and strong enough to offer alternative in the sense of local, and not only local, but government to the population. ISIS is providing also an alternative in this sense in the territories he managed to capture. So it's not anymore another fighting group joined to the long list of hundreds of separate groups fighting all over Syria. This is a dramatic change, and I think we should follow it very closely because, yes, for the first time, there is a threat to the stability and to the survival of the regime if this tendency continues. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Zisser, and please, Jonathan Speyer, take the lead.
Good morning. I think my remarks will follow on quite conveniently from Professor Zisser's final section, because what I want to try to do in this relatively short amount of time available to me is to consider the current reality of IS as a quasi-state, as I'm going to call it, and to examine the chances of the longevity of this state, and to think about the implications of its emergence for the sectarian war currently taking place in Iraq in a more complex way in Syria and increasingly also in Lebanon. And I'll, at the end, if I have time, try to look a little bit at Western policy options in this regard. Regarding then the nature of the quasi-state that has emerged, IS or ISIS or ISIL or Daesh or whatever you prefer has controlled what today constitutes the heartland of this entity, which is Raqqa city and its environs, since June 2013. This means that there is now sufficient time, in my estimation, to examine the nature of the administration it has established and thus to draw some tentative conclusions regarding its possible longevity or, conversely, its vulnerability. Reporting from Raqqa is, of course, difficult, but a number of reporters have managed to enter Raqqa province, or at least to maintain contact with individuals within Raqqa city and within the province. And so it's become possible to piece together a broad picture of what IS governance looks like. The picture that emerges is an interesting one. The behavior of IS famously or notably toward minority communities in Raqqa itself initially and subsequently in Mosul in Iraq and in the Sinjar area has been, of course, characterized by a barbaric cruelty. But the evidence emerging from Raqqa is that IS rule over the Sunni Arab population there combines uncompromising repression of all opposition with a rudimentary but functioning administration which succeeds in managing the daily life of the population. IS, after conquering Raqqa, initiated a brutal process of crackdown, which led to the departure of minorities and the departure or death, or a swift demise, of activists from rival organizations. But once this period was over, this initial brutal, terrifying period was concluded, and the population had been cowed into submission, a system of governance notably willing to make use of the skills of former regime employees has come into being. So, according to one IS fighter quoted in a recent Reuters investigation into this matter, a former Assad employee, for example, is now in charge of the crucial task of running mills and distributing flour to bakeries in Raqqa. That's to say, making sure that the population does not starve. Employees at the Raqqa Dam, which provides the city with electricity and water, have similarly remained in their posts. Experts have arrived from North Africa and Europe to perform technical functions on behalf of this quasi-state administration. The man appointed to run and develop, for example, Raqqa's telecoms is a Tunisian with a PhD in this matter. Similarly, with regard to administration, IS has separated military operations from civil administration, with fighters serving only as police and soldiers. Civilian deputies, called walis, have been assigned responsibility for specific areas, for specific sectors. Administrative regions are divided into waliyas, which sometimes align with existing divisions, and fascinatingly, as with the case of Al-Furat province, sometimes span national boundaries, as to say, obliterate effectively the old border between Iraq and Syria. Fighters and employees, and there's been a number of reports on this recently, receive a salary from a department called the Muslim Financial House. Fighters receive housing also, including often in homes confiscated from local non-Sunnis or from government employees who fled the area. And we even know, or we are told at least by a recent report, I believe in the London Times on the matter, that the salary that you can expect if you're thinking of joining the IS as a rank-and-file fighter is between $400 to $600 per month, not a princely sum by any means, of course, but certainly sufficient to sustain life in the limited conditions or difficult conditions of northeast Syria. Similarly, prices are kept low, traders who manipulate prices are punished, a primitive or rudimentary tax system has also been imposed. I hope people find these details of interest. I think that they are intrinsically interesting. But I list them not in order to offer a celebration of ISIS's new order in Raqqa and Mosul, but merely to observe that in the course of the last year, the movement has created a primitive system of administration in the area it controls, which shows no sign of collapsing as a result of the extremism or incompetence of IS leaders. And this fact is further reflected in the relative weakness at the present time of those organizations within Raqqa or within Mosul which have emerged within that area which seek to end the rule of IS. A number of such groups have emerged, and if I can offer a little plug for one of the publications which I edit, there's an interesting article coming up by my colleague Ayman Jawad al-Tamimi in the next edition of Middle East Review International Affairs, specifically dealing with this issue of opposition groups within the ISIS-controlled area seeking to end its rule. The most significant of these groups are the Kataib al-Mosul and the Harakat Ahrar al-Mosul, both of which are armed groups which are seeking to ignite a Sunni insurgency within the area ruled by IS. There have been a series of attacks using IEDs or gun attacks against IS personnel carried out by these organizations. A number of IS men have been killed. But at least at the present time, there seems to be no danger of serious internal pressure on the rulers of the Islamic State. Severe repression and the establishment, as we noted earlier, of a basic but functioning system of governance are likely to ensure the continuation of this reality for the immediate and foreseeable future. So to conclude this first section, the Islamic State is of course not a state in the real or full sense of the word. But it may be said, in my estimation, to have joined the growing list of quasi-states that form a characteristic presence in the post-Cold War landscape, and in particular in the Middle East. Such entities as the Hamas enclave in Gaza, or the Republic of Transnistria, if people are familiar with it, in Eastern Europe, arguably also the emergent Kurdish cantons, the 3 Kurdish cantons in northern Syria. Entities of this type, which of course don't have a seat on the United Nations General Assembly, but which nevertheless are able to ensure the minimum necessary to ensure their continued existence. What this means, to draw the bottom line on this matter, is that unless the Islamic State is destroyed from the outside, it is likely to continue its existence. Repressive, brutal, certainly, dysfunctional, probably, but alive. This then leads naturally to the question of whether and how the Islamic State can be destroyed from without. This, of course, as we know, is now the stated goal of the United States President. And we, on our news broadcast this morning, we're hearing about the process whereby the United States is setting about crystallizing a policy supposedly intended to bring about this goal, or this objective. A recent and interesting article by Michael Knights for the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point noted what the author perceived to be the very considerable military vulnerabilities of IS, specifically when in defensive mode. Knights attributes IS's success in aggressive operations in both Syria and in Iraq since its emergence to the following elements, and I'm going to quote a little section from Knight's piece here. To quote, "Surprise, mobility, and shock are the principal characteristics of ISIL offensive operations in Iraq. The group often achieves tactical surprise, whether against the federal ICF or Kurdish forces. This is attained through rapid approach marches that utilize Iraq's dense, high-quality road network and often culminate in night or dawn attacks. Mobility and deception allow ISIL forces to achieve local superiority in numbers despite their smaller strength in comparison to state-armed forces with aggressive platoon-sized or company-sized raiding columns, defeating and dislodging successive ISF or Kurdish positions. Probes and feints appear to be common elements in ISIL offensives, often apparently intended to test opposition, bypass solid defenses, and draw away enemy forces from the main target." Close quote. What Knights is describing here sounds like a hybrid military force somewhere between a regular and an irregular army. The vulnerability of such a force is in static defense of areas it rules, where its skills, rapidity, flexibility, high levels of commitment become less relevant. It should further be noted, and this is me speaking, not Knights, but I assume or hope that he would agree with me too, and that you will too. It should be noted that in its periods of rapid expansion, Islamic State, or ISIS, faced only second-rate military forces. Assad's conscripts in eastern Syria, the empty shell, as it turned out, of the ISF of Nouri al-Maliki, beset by sectarian divisions as its garrison in Mosul city was, and of course the Kurdish Peshmerga, who had not fought for 20 years previously, and which itself suffers from a serious problem of motivation among its own fighters. I was in northern Iraq just under a week and a half ago, and I had the opportunity to spend some time with the Peshmerga and to visit some of the front lines around Erbil city, and this issue of motivation of Peshmerga fighters is a fascinating one, which if we have time in questions and answers, I'll be happy to elaborate on. So for these various reasons, then, the prowess of Islamic State, even in attack, may well have been exaggerated. The current situation, as we are all observing, is one in which ISIL in Iraq is rapidly now losing ground to attacks by Iraqi and Kurdish forces backed by US air power. The loss of Emile a couple of weeks ago was a pivotal moment in this. ISIS, or IS, lacks experienced fighters in this area. It has a mobile force, probably totaling not more than 3,000 men, and with defensive manpower consisting mainly of allied movements, that's say not ISIS members themselves, and new recruits. If the tide is perceived then to be turning against IS in Iraq, these elements could begin to desert. And I listed here, and I can, there's a whole number of areas that lost. The Mosul Dam, of course, Mahmoud, Amarli, we mentioned a moment ago, the Christian town of Karakosh, and a number of others, already been lost by ISIS in recent days. But here's the crucial point in this regard. These are outlying towns that IS recently conquered, and it is now rapidly losing. But when it comes to the areas closer to the Iraqi-Syrian border, and still more to the heartland of Raqqa province, whose administration I discussed at the beginning, dislodging the Islamic State is likely to be far harder. Here is where its most committed fighters are situated, and in any case, neither the ISF, the Iraqi security forces, nor the Peshmerga can or will cross the border into Syria to complete this work. This is an absolutely crucial and central point. And in this regard, let me turn to the final section of my talk, in which I'd like to look a little bit at the issues and problems facing the West in formulating a policy in this regard. The strategic problem facing the United States in developing a coherent policy beyond preventing further IS advances and chipping away at its holdings in Iraq is that the US has now committed itself openly to a policy of destroying the Islamic State. But it does not wish to commit ground forces, nor does it wish to intervene in Syria, and nor can its allies in Iraq do more than chip away at the edges of the Islamic State. That's to say, to put it very bluntly, the Islamic State will be destroyed when ground forces enter Raqqa province in Syria and retake it, and only thus. But the only ground forces which conceivably could do that are those of the Assad regime, assisted by Hezbollah and the Iranians. And even then, as we heard from Eyal before, very notably, maybe not even them. Of course, the effect of such an outcome, were this to be achieved, would be the partial reversal of the fragmentation of Syria and Iraq and their reunification under Iranian tutelage. This would be an entirely negative outcome from the West's point of view, delivering a victory to its most powerful regional adversary. In this regard, I draw your attention to the fact that the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps is already present in Iraq, that there have been noted the presence of Quds Force teams in Samarra, in Baghdad, in Karbala, and at the former al-Askari air base near Tikrit. Iran has also deployed 7 Su-25 ground attack aircraft, which played a role in offering air support to the Kurds and to Iraqi special forces. So, to begin to conclude, if Western policy continues to be limited to bombing raids and backup to Iraqi and Kurdish forces against the IS, then the IS is likely to remain, IS, let's say Islamic State, is likely to remain, bruised to be sure, but in existence for some time to come. But if the West truly commits itself to the destruction of the Islamic State, given the West's determination not to become too closely involved in Iraq, and still less in Syria, the likelihood will be, as with the destruction of the previous incarnation of Sunni power in Iraq, the regime of Saddam Hussein, that the victory ultimately may well go to Iran. Given the reality outlined earlier, this is the not particularly attractive set of options currently available to US and Western policymakers vis-à-vis the Islamic State. That is to say, if I can just sum up in a couple of minutes the points I've tried to make. Firstly, that the Islamic State will not disappear by itself as a result of internal unrest. There is a system of administration in place, there is a system of brutal repression in place, there is therefore little danger of that. Secondly, the IS has been suffering defeats in recent weeks, certainly in Iraq, but nevertheless these defeats are nowhere close to being fatal. Thirdly, according to all available evidence, the United States and the West are determined not to go in on the ground, and the only force which could possibly go in on the ground to take out the heartland of the Islamic State in the Raqqa province in Syria is that of the Shia alliance, so to speak, the Iranians, Assad and Hezbollah, which means, fourthly, and on this I will conclude, given that it is unlikely that the West would afford the kind of backing necessary to give an okay to Assad and the Iranians and their friends to destroy the Islamic State, it is likely that the Islamic State, in one form or another, will continue in existence, despite the efforts to destroy it, for some time to come. And on this, I will conclude by saying, in my estimation, the Islamic State, for all the various horrors it has already been responsible for bringing down on some very unfortunate Western and American families, one of whom, by the way, I knew. I was an acquaintance of Stephen Sotloff. For all those horrors. Ultimately, IS, in my estimation at least, represents the coming together of the Sunni side, the Sunni Arab side, in an ongoing sectarian war, crossing the borders of the states once known as Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. This is a war which may well still just be beginning, and which has almost certainly not yet reached its height. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I must say that I like the way that you conclude 3 times your conclusion. And now I want Shiraz, Maher, please, talk about. Wait. Okay. Preparation, Shiraz. Everything is connected. In a minute. That's you? Yeah. That's it? That's it.
Good morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about the influence that ISIS foreign fighters are having and will have on Europe. And in the context of doing this, I wanted to touch upon actually also looking at the impact that these foreign fighters are having on ISIS itself, and to look at it in both ways. So just to give a quick overview, I'm going to divide my presentation into 3 sort of broad subheadings. Who goes to Syria from Europe, and what do they do? What do Europeans offer ISIS? And then the new threats posed by these foreign fighters, both within Syria and in Europe. So to start with, in terms of who goes, these are a set of figures that our center put out in December. They're actually put together by Aaron, who's at the back. We haven't really updated them in a great capacity since last December, other than to have begun to sort of put broad estimates out there. So overall, today, we believe there's somewhere in the region, from Europe at least, of 2,500 foreign fighters who have gone out to Syria, who are participating in the conflict. Not every single one of those fighters is with the Islamic State, but increasingly the overwhelming majority are with that group, and certainly the people who are going now tend to go that way. So if you consider the flow of foreign fighters out to Syria from January 2013, when it really began to pick up in Europe, we began to see people from North Africa earlier on in 2012, for example. But certainly from Europe, it became a thing, it became a phenomenon through 2013, sorry. Then you were finding greater selection, a greater diversity in the sorts of groups that they were going towards. But now, increasingly, as I say, they are going towards the Islamic State for pretty obvious reasons. It's a group that is in the ascendancy, it has declared the caliphate, and people are attracted to it for those reasons. And it's also the group, of course, that has the best weapons. And so, again, for that reason, people are sort of drawn to it. What's interesting from these figures, of course, as well, is if you look at the raw numbers, they're kind of pretty broad. But when you weight them per capita in relation to the size of the Muslim community in those countries, then you begin to see some very interesting things. So Belgium, of course, as you can see, is way off the charts. Scandinavian countries are very highly represented. The Netherlands is highly represented. And then, of course, Britain and France are also well represented in terms of their contribution of fighters to the conflict. The Europeans in ISIS, there was always a sense, and I think this was true to an extent, that unlike fighters coming in from other places, the Chechens, for example, Bosnians, and they brought in a lot of very specific combat experience, very vital for an organization like ISIS to bring in fighters that have active guerrilla warfare experience, who are able to give the group a sort of richness of experience in that sense. A lot of the foreign fighters that we spoke to who'd gone from Europe were saying, in the initial phases at least, that they found it pretty boring, actually. They'd gone out of there, that they had had all these great hopes and aspirations of being on the front lines, and they were basically doing guard duty. Over time, we've seen that they are not there to take a backseat. The longer they're there, the more experienced they're becoming, the more ingrained they become in this conflict, the more brutalized they become, and the more willing they become to try and push themselves to the forefront of this. So since February, in fact, of this year, we've documented Europeans, and I can say Brits in every one of these scenarios as well, have been suicide bombers. They've tortured detainees in their care. They've executed prisoners of war and civilians, and they've imposed arbitrary punishments on the local populations, as Jonathan was mentioning previously in his own presentation. And that's a remarkable facet of what's taken place here, is that these are Europeans who've gone over, who are imposing this on the very people in whose defense they once claimed to act. So here I have a tweet from a British foreign fighter out in Syria, and it really kind of shows you the sheer brazenness, actually, of what they've engaged in and of what's taken place. So he says, got these criminals today, inshallah will be killed tomorrow. Can't wait for that feeling when you just kill someone. And so when so this is one fighter with whom we had a line of communication, actually. So we asked them why they were holding these guys. These are Syrians. This is a result of the infighting that took place. And you know, these guys were unfortunate to be on the opposing side.
Is there a photo in there as well?
Sorry, is there a? Yes. Oh, it's very difficult to see. Sorry, this.
Could you turn off the lights behind there for a moment?
Geez, it's three men basically who are blindfolded and sitting on the floor in a room. Sorry, I didn't realize you couldn't see it. Yeah, so these are three Syrians that they had captured. A change of motivation is another thing we've noted, certainly in terms of what they say to us. And the change of motivation here, I mentioned, well, in the first instance, when we would speak to people, particularly again, as I say, at the start of 2013 or in the first half of that year, we had a lot of people saying that they'd come to defend the civilians, that they'd come to help the Syrian people. And they were very keen to stress this point, saying, you know, you've seen the news, you've seen what's happening in Aleppo, in other parts of the country, look at the women, look at the children, and there was a lot of that. Even within ISIS, I think as a movement, it hadn't emerged as quite so brutal, but has increasingly over time morphed into this incredibly draconian, hardline organization. So I mentioned, if you're looking at the Islamic State itself, this partly due, of course, to its fallout with al-Qaeda and the dispute between Zawahiri and Baghdadi. But putting that to one side, there's been a broader alienation from what you might call the hierarchy or the aristocracy of the sort of intellectual global jihad movement. So the Islamic State has been condemned by the likes of Maqdisi, Abu Qatada, Muhaysini, people for whom their sort of rubber stamping would generally be seen as pretty important. But the Islamic State has actually weathered all of this. It stood back from all of this and said, it doesn't matter. And it's dismissed all of their criticisms and concerns in a number of different ways, sometimes dismissing them by saying that they've gone soft, sometimes dismissing them by saying that they've fallen prey to Western propaganda or that they don't understand the issues. But for whatever reason, they've generally overcome this. But the foreigners have hardened too. So, as I mentioned, they've become quite brutal killers. They've become very hardened during their time out in Syria. And they no longer talk to us about civilians. They no longer talk to us and say, you know, we're here to defend people or we're here to fight Assad. It's become very clear that they have one primary overarching aim now, which is to establish the Islamic State, and now that it's established, to consolidate it and to further its goals and aims. So I'm showing you here, this is a question that was asked. I don't know how familiar people are in the room. I assume there's varying degrees of familiarity with the conflict and with the foreign fighters there. But Ask FM is a platform where people can ask questions, and the sort of creator of the various accounts will answer those questions. And a lot of foreign fighters use Ask FM as their platform or medium with which to engage other people. So this was a question asked of a British foreign fighter with the Islamic State. He died very recently. About his sort of motivations and what the average Syrian thinks of the Muhajirin, the foreigners who have gone out to the country. Do they want the Muhajirin who are out there, or are they sort of hostile to them? So he says some love us, those who have the good aqidah, those who have the good belief, and are in jihad themselves. However, there are a number of them that dislike us. However, the lands belong to Allah, not to them. also I came here to please my creator, not them. And so this is very interesting because this is one of the original guys who, when he first went out, would say to us that his primary motivation for being there was to defend the people, was to respond to the conflict as he saw it in terms of the defense of civilians. And now he's saying, you know, actually I don't care about these people. I came here for these reasons, and this is my objective. So this is a propaganda poster put out by a brigade. It's got a lot of British fighters within it, Red Tawhid. And I mean, I love it in the sense I think it's the most honest statement, actually, of their principles, and it's the most honest statement of what they're out to achieve. It says, we don't want to free Syria, we want to establish Sharia. And again, this sort of puts to bed, in large cases at least, the notion that a lot of these guys put out of this being a heroic fight in the defense of civilians, a heroic fight in the defense of innocents who are being persecuted or killed by their own government. So I'm going to show you more of these posters, actually, because I think they're very interesting, and I think they tell you a lot about what's happening there. So in this context, so what do the Europeans offer the Islamic State? They're not very good fighters on the whole. They've come there with no combat experience. So what do these guys add? What's the value that they bring with them? Well, they can produce a lot of slick propaganda, like the poster I just showed you, and I'm going to show you several more. They can communicate with Western Muslims because they are Western Muslims. So there's no sense of having to jump through any hoops or barriers. They know exactly how to get that message out there. And that feeds, of course, into recruitment and incitement. Again, because they know what cultural anchors appeal to Muslims in the West, it comes pretty naturally to them. And you know, it's been mentioned, of course, the killing of James Foley and Sotloff. If you look at the packaging of those videos and the whole presentation and the delivery and the framing, it's clear that it had a large input from the Western contingent of foreign fighters who are within the Islamic State in the way that that message was framed very tightly towards Obama, towards attempting almost to blackmail the U.S. administration. You may want to turn the light off again because I have pictures. So we've seen okay. So we've seen different messaging coming out at different times of the conflict in terms of how they've attempted to recruit people, how they've attempted to make the Islamic State or ISIS, as it was certainly at that point, appeal to different people in the West. One of the things that the fighters put out themselves, it came from them. It wasn't a tabloid creation. It wasn't something that the press came up with. Something that they put out themselves. They called it the 5-star jihad. They said, look, jihad out here is really good right now. It's pretty fun. In a lot of cases, they said, we're living better lives right now here than we were living in the West. You should come out here. And part of that process was also to create a sense of normalization, to say, look, your home comforts, the things you're kind of used to, don't worry about it. We have them. So you don't need to worry. And so here you can see it says jihad, sponsored by Pot Noodles and Asda. And if any of you have been to the United Kingdom, Asda, it's a big supermarket. So they show, and he's got a snack bar, obviously, in the top right-hand corner from there. Here's another picture of a house that they were using. This is in the Atma province, just over the border. It says Jihad, the Goodly Life. And there were a lot of pictures from inside this house. I mean, it was a very comfortable house. I mean, you can see from the outside, it's hardly run down. But this was all feeding, again, as I say, into their narrative of saying, look, jihad out here is great. It's a lot of fun. You should get out here right now while it's still the good life. So again, if you're familiar with Pimp My Ride, then here it is, Pimp My Ride, jihadi style. So this is another picture of them, again, promoting the 5-star jihad idea. This is a group of British foreign fighters. This is in a complex called Beit al-Muhajirin, the House of the Immigrants. And they were, well, as you can see, having what they project to be a fairly good time. And these pictures, although they're not particularly dressed up in any ideological terms. There's no huge message behind it. We're actually very successful for a long time in terms of attracting people, because it gave this impression of it being, of Syria and the conflict being like a jihadi summer camp. You can come out here with your buddies, come out with 2 or 3 friends, and you're going to have a great time. And not only are you going to have a great time, but you're going to have access to these really cool things. You're going to get an RPG, you'll get an AK-47, and it fed into this idea of masculinity, of adventure-seeking, and of religious validation for a lot of these guys. And so you're bolting in multiple motivations and drivers here for these guys just through a series of pictures. You don't need to have long discursive essays about the Quran or Hadith and fighting oppression. And it's like, here you go, come with your friends and have a good time. I think this picture, again, is from Red Tawheed. Very, very interesting insofar as it's showing kind of their worldview, certainly in terms of what they can offer, as I mentioned with the Islamic State, that what they're able to deliver. Inspire the believers. His gun is slung around his shoulder, and what's he aiming with? What's he got? He's got a camera. And these guys have been very good at putting out this type of propaganda. They have a Twitter account, by the way. You should check it out for lots more of these pictures. But as I say, it gives you a good sense of how they view their participation in this conflict. Here's another one. It's a little more dramatic. It's a little more bullish. And this was interesting because this was coming out around the time when they were saying, why is the West getting concerned about us? We're not a threat to anybody. We're not going to do anything there. And then here you have a man, obviously, clearly outside the White House with a big sign saying, wait a while. And so these things appeal to a certain type of person. And you can see the way the pictures are put together. They're put together very powerfully and in a very seductive format. So this is one side of where we understand and we know that the Islamic State and groups like it have prioritized or placed a premium on having their message get out there in a slick, accessible, easy format. And here is a bunch of guys who are able to do this in English in a fashion that will translate very easily and very successfully to audiences in Britain, in the United States, and in other parts of the Western English-speaking world. I think this picture is very interesting on the grounds that it appeals to another type of person. So we've moved on from the kind of adventure-seeking jihadi to the one who essentially says, jihad is my shortcut to paradise. Get out to Syria, take a bullet, and wake up in paradise. And that's it. And there are a lot of fighters like that. You can do it in Europe. It's not geographically specific. Yeah. So there are a lot of people who really believe this. And there are a lot of fighters who are very much in that category. From the moment they get into Syria, they're telling us, I'm just waiting to die. I'm just waiting for that bullet, for that bomb, whatever it is to arrive and to hit us, because this is my shortcut to paradise. And they also regard it as a path to redemption. So they might tell us, well, I've had this past, I was doing this, I was doing this. And they believe that rather than sort of attempt to redeem themselves in the eyes of God through some other way, this is the way to do it because it's instantaneous, it's quick, and it's all-encompassing. It will envelop all of their sins and absolve them. So you're right to Jannah. Here's another one, again, aimed at mobilizing people back in the West. And what I think is interesting here is saying, okay, if you can't come, if you can't fight out here, help us, equip the fighter, give us money. A lot of appeals, of course, for cash from the West. And a lot of this money would travel through much of the last year, 2013, on aid convoys. Again, we've documented through our center tens of thousands of pounds in cash turning up in the hands of fighters, ostensibly, of course, leaving the UK under the guise of being aid or aid provision and turning up there. And so here, again, you see the fighter dressed in a suit, but then with the balaclava. It's very clever, very simple. But it's saying, okay, if you can't be here, you can still be just like us. Just help us out. Give us some money and help us equip ourselves. And there are actually a number of prosecutions going on right now in the UK for people who basically acted, not necessarily on the basis of this poster, but of posters like it, who had sent money over to friends or to relatives to help them purchase weaponry, AK-47s, that kind of thing. This is the final one of the sort of propaganda that I'm going to show. So this one's more religiously couched. It talks about the virtues of jihad, and it's got the guys obviously marching out. So it's appealing in two ways. One, on the religious level, to people for whom that religious justification or motivation is going to be important. But again, it's showing their friends, it's showing a group of guys, all Brits in this picture, heading out to go and fight. And it's saying, look, come with your friends. This is the summer camp. Normalizing it. So the threats then in Syria and in Europe. Well, we've seen very, very dramatically, of course, in the last few weeks, the role and the extent to which foreign fighters are very much at the forefront. As I was mentioning earlier, they're not there to take a back seat. And there's been a lot of celebration of Foley, to an extent of Sotloff as well, given the Sotloff's connections here. I'm only using Foley's things so as not to be sensitive to individuals who may have known Sotloff. So you can see here, so the top guy, Abu Kaka, he is a Brit. He's from Manchester. His tweet went up straight after the event. What a beautiful message to America. Or the best IS, Islamic State video so far, message to America. Here's two more. I won't read the top one because of the swearing involved in it, but you can read it for yourself. And then the one below it of a Canadian foreign fighter, again, very callous, very brutal, but really demonstrating, I think, the extent to which the idea that these were guys who have gone out there who are sort of not getting involved in this to its fullest extent is basically a lie. They are embracing this in a terrible, terrible fashion. We also saw a number of threats aimed at the West, attempting to mobilize, either to threaten populations or attempting to mobilize people back in the West to do things there. So he's the top one, again, from another UK foreign fighter, and he mimics a lot of the sort of statements we've seen before. The UK people, you will pay because of the actions of your government. Blame them, not us. And then this other guy below him is a guy called Ismail Jabba. He's from Hounslow in London, so it's near Heathrow. And he says all the people, all the guys in this aqidah and manhaj, in this belief, in this way, this method, who want to make hijrah, please just do something in the West, chop someone up, please retweet this. So very much an attempt to almost replicate the murder of drummer Lee Rigby and to get people to do that. And he actually tweeted this kind of thing out quite a few times until Twitter shut his account down. So how does this ultimately play out in terms of those guys are out there? How does it play out in terms of the West? Well, the guy we just saw, Mehdi Namouche, was a former member of the Islamic State. He fought out in Syria. He returned back to France and then went to Brussels and killed 4 people at the Jewish Museum. And, as we've learned subsequently, he also appears to have been one of the prison guards for some of the Westerners held hostage in Syria. And by the accounts, again, that have emerged, one of the more sadistic characters, was involved in torture, was involved in a number of war crimes against other civilians under the Islamic State's control. Again, demonstrating the extent to which these guys have really pushed themselves to the forefront of that conflict and engaged in all its brutality in all its forms, but are also returning back to the West and carrying out attacks and activity there. Now, what's not clear, and what we don't know right now, is whether this was an ISIS-directed attack, so he was told to come back and do it, or whether he returned for other reasons, but then decided independently to do something. But by and large, it's an irrelevance. These guys, by virtue of having been out in Syria, have gained combat experience. They've been trained in weapons. They know what to do. And again, studies show, of course, that people who have this kind of background and experience, if and when they turn to terrorism, are more likely to be involved in successful plots that actually work. Their plots are more likely to take a greater number of lives because, again, they have that experience. And so in that context, that makes the returnee threat a very real one. And if you're coming to my later presentation, then I go into that in a lot more detail. So what are the implications for Europe? And this is the end of my presentation, really. I say there are thousands of EU passport holders. They have free movement across the continent, and it's basically impossible to monitor them all. And so on that kind of depressing note, I'm going to stop. You finished? I finished.
Thank you very much, Shiraz. Excellent presentation. And now, please, Emile Simpson. It's your turn.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to speak today. I want to focus on Western reactions to ISIS. And I specifically mean the United States and other Western allies, such as the United Kingdom, who are contemplating extending military action against ISIS. Look, the key strategic question, it seems to me, especially in the minds of the public in the United States, I'm currently based at Harvard, so I'm exposed to that quite a bit, but also in the UK, which is my home country, is can those Western states extend military action against ISIS without being engaged in an open-ended commitment which will be massively expensive in treasure and possibly blood too? Will it be a repeat of the first Iraq war or not? That's what people want to know. And that seems to me to turn on what do you mean by defeating ISIS? And I do not think that's been made particularly clear. On the one hand, we have this idea that defeat is a military concept. We saw that in Iraq and Afghanistan in the earlier stages of the campaign. You can deny a force the overt control of a given jurisdiction, to deny them the governing authority. And because to be a governing authority, you have to be the open force. You have to present yourself in the open and be prepared to fight conventionally. Western forces can do that. We saw that in Iraq and Afghanistan. That is the bread and butter of conventional forces, and we will win. So I don't see a problem with denying ISIL the overt control of a jurisdiction. That is the narrow sense of defeat. The more long-term sense of defeat means defeating the follow-on insurgency. And that is a completely different proposition, because once you're talking about insurgents who you've pushed underground, the fight becomes indistinguishable from local politics. I spent 3 tours in Afghanistan as an infantry officer trying to fight the Taliban insurgency. And it's a highly political fight, because you don't just have to deal with taking violent action against the hardcore Taliban insurgents, you have to deal with all the politics, the governance issues, all the tribes who are competing with each other, some joining the Taliban, some the government. In the case of Afghanistan, you have to deal with the corruption, the ethnic mix of the security forces, land rights, water rights that cause people to join the insurgency. All kinds of political grievances come to attach. And the West is fundamentally ill-configured to deal with those kind of issues. Local politics has to be fixed by local people. Western forces should not take ownership of fixing the political problems. We cannot do that. That has to be the regional states whose own broken politics has given rise to ISIS in the first place. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Iran, most obviously Iraq and Baghdad sectarian politics. As soon as the West says, we will defeat ISIS, we will chase ISIS to the gates of hell, as US Vice President Joe Biden said, if I were a regional state, I'd say, hey, I can relax now. The West has said they will defeat ISIL in that long-term sense. And if the West takes ownership of that secondary and longer-term political fight, the regional powers will, the more the West take responsibility, the more the regional powers will shirk their responsibility, and the more the West will be trapped in a long-term and massively expensive fight. So my basic proposition is that there is a military option on the table for the West to defeat ISIS, but it attaches to the narrow and initial military phase where you deny ISIL overt control of a jurisdiction. Beyond that, the West can support, of course, we can support the regional powers, but they have to own their own political and security problems. It's their politics to fix. And the idea that publics in the United States and the UK will tolerate a massively expensive war with potential casualties to fix problems that they really can't fix is unrealistic. So when I say there are two definitions of defeat, and the West can take ownership of the first, but not the second, what we have is a vision where you have three, you have the West defeating ISIL in terms of denying them the overt control of the jurisdiction with three caveats, three conditions. The first condition is there will be areas in which we cannot take ISIL territory on the ground because there are no adequate local forces, most obviously in Syria. The idea of arming the Free Syrian Army is fanciful. That's exactly what we did in Libya. You arm a fragmented rebel group and you end up with utter chaos, because the idea that a common enemy equals a common political cause is an assumption, it's not a fact. And unless you have a symmetry of political cause, very soon after the common enemy is gone, you have they will move away from your political goals, and you'll have just another Islamist group in Syria. So in that area, ISIL can be hit hard, can be pushed underground through air power, but ultimately it has to be the regional powers who take on the long-term commitment to defeat the insurgency in a political sense in Syria, not the West. Western publics will not tolerate a long-term engagement in Syria, so it's unrealistic anyway. In Iraq and Kurdistan, it's a different situation. There is the possibility of pushing ISIL out. In Kurdistan, there's a region. Kurdistan and Iraq are different from the Libya examples. In Libya, we back rebels. In Kurdistan and Iraq, we'll be backing coherent political forces who can own a jurisdiction and govern it in a coherent way that equals stability and who are generally well, not necessarily pro-Western, but at least not actively Islamist. In Kurdistan, we've already seen that the Peshmerga forces with Western air power have been able to move out into the disputed territories with Baghdad, around Kirkuk, and to a lesser extent now around Mosul. In Iraq, the situation is clearly more complicated because you have a Shia militia-infested Iraqi security forces, and like I said before, in terms of the politics, Western air power is not going to change the fact that until Baghdad makes an accommodation with the Sunni tribes in Anbar, you are not going to have coherence on the ground if you have Western air power backing Shia militias going to retake Sunni areas. It has to be the Sunni tribes who are going to push out ISIS on the ground, with support perhaps from the Shia security forces, with support from some Western forces, but they have to own the problem. And the idea that this will be easy is an aspiration. It's not hard fact. There is not hard fact that the Sunni tribes will flip. They've been systematically abused by Nouri al-Maliki for the last 3 years. Maybe Abadi will be better. Who knows? We'll see. The indications are going in the right direction. But my point is, let's be cautious about the extent to which we're going to see a sudden flip from guys who've been badly let down for 3 years by Baghdad. They're suddenly going to change sides. I mean, they're human beings. They're rational actors. They have their own interests at heart. You know, they're going to be weighing up those risks very, very carefully. I think the idea that it will be easy to retake Sunni areas in Iraq warrants caution. The third element is who owns the narrative, who owns the governance on the ground. I've already touched on this. The point is, what are the beyond ISIL? How far does the West commitment go? What if forces on the ground start acting in an undemocratic way? Is the West locked in until we see democracy, or are we only talking about defeating ISIL and accepting whatever governance comes afterwards? That's an open question. We don't know. It hasn't been defined. So clearly, unless we define it, we're not clear on the extent of the commitment. Because if we are saying, well, look, an extension of Western military action is premised on defeating ISIL. That's the hook it's hung on. We don't go further. if we say, no, we're not going to stop until there's a coherent system of governance on the ground across the whole battle space, and by coherent we mean democratic, then we're in for a much longer term commitment. The other aspect in terms of the Western publics are the moral limits of the West commitment. You know, Tacitus, the Roman author, talked about Roman counterinsurgency in Britain, and he said they made a wasteland and called it peace. Let's not kid ourselves. The local forces aren't going to obey international humanitarian law against ISIL. So exterminate ISIL slips off the tongue now, but it will scar the eyes later when we see what reprisals in civilian supporting areas looks like. I mean, that's the reality. And as soon as you see that, Western publics are going to lose support for this campaign. So we need to think about the moral limits of the West commitment here and what these ground forces are really going to do, and not look at ground forces in this kind of blanket way, but think about who they actually are. You know, and in Syria, a lot of these sort of so-called moderate oppositions are basically Al-Qaeda. So I have strong reservations about the extent to which we can really back anybody in Syria. So I'd like to summarize now in terms of just an observation on strategy. It seems to me that the West does have a military option, and I think the West should definitely take on ISIS in the initial phase, aiming for a clear military defeat in the narrow sense of denying ISIL the overt control of a jurisdiction. And in the longer-term phase, supporting through a whole range of means regional powers to defeat ISIL in that longer-term political sense. But they should not own the problem. As soon as they do, regional powers will move away and shirk their own responsibility. And this, in a more abstract sense, for those of you interested in strategy, I think the West has a very classical view of strategy. We say, let's define our endpoint. Before we can clearly define the endpoint, we don't have a strategy. The problem with this is that although there is an endpoint which is definable perhaps in Kurdistan and in Iraq, and in perhaps the Kurdish areas of Syria too, in most of Syria, anybody who says, I know what the end game is going to be in Syria, I think is fooling themselves. Nobody knows. Nobody I know, and I certainly don't know, what the end game is going to be in Syria. So you can't make a strategy based on some kind of clear end state. It's a leap in the dark. So strategy moves away from this classical idea of ends, means, and ways where you have to define your end. It's more about managing risk. And you're saying, what are my risks, and how can I make decisions which I think are sensible and move forward, not necessarily cautiously, but in terms of clear steps on the ground, and then and as things play out, using opportunities as they arise to maybe change one's position. So my basic point is that the West should not commit at this stage to a decisive defeat of ISIL in a long-term political sense. It should commit in the narrow initial sense, and it should put most responsibility for the long-term defeat on regional powers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emile. And now, my friend, Yoram Schweitzer, please.
Thank you. I was asked to talk about the perception of threat from ISIS in Israeli side. I think when you look at it, you have to look at it from various angles, whether it's a direct or indirect threat, whether it's in proximate closeness to Israel, or whether it's remote, and on the short term and the long term. A second fact that helps you to try to analyze this problem is to determine that it's not the problem of Israel only. Basically, Israel is hitchhiking on the fact that it's a global world, it's a global problem, and Israel should not jump ahead. Third, Israel has ample of security problems, and I don't think that ISIS is the first and the primary one. Third, we are dealing in our borders with some failed states, feeble regimes, and with ungoverned areas where the governments are strong enough. So when we look at the problem of ISIS, I think when we look at Iraq, Iraq is a remote place from Israel, is not a direct threat on Israel, and in the short term, it seems that ISIS from Iraq is not a threat. When you are looking at the Syrian situation, it's a little bit different, but not that much. In Syria, ISIS, as we have seen in the map, is concentrated on Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, which is not on the borders of Israel. On the other hand, we have another foe, which I think that we should put a lot of emphasis on, is Jabhat al-Nusra. Jabhat al-Nusra is basically Al-Qaeda. It's one of the partners of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has 4 partnerships, close partnerships. Jabhat al-Nusra was the one that was lately joined this. We are talking about Al-Qaeda in the Hijaz, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Shabab al-Somali, and Jabhat al-Nusra, which replaced ISIS or IS or ISI before it became ISIS, and now it's IS, and had direct confrontation with Al-Qaeda. So Jabhat al-Nusra, which is sitting on our borders, again in the Golan Heights, in the Syrian Golan Heights and near Jordan, there is a presence of Jabhat al-Nusra. As Eyal said, it is mixed with other elements, but we have seen the flags of Al-Qaeda on our borders, and this is more of a threat. I wouldn't capitulate because they are there, but more of a threat to Israel, and more direct one. One of the problems of ISIS, more than its might, force, and power, is the bad and negative spirit that it spread and project all over. But if it was only the bad spirit, I would have not be that cautious. But it has a lot of money, and it has sophisticated arms. And they are looking to spread their influence, and they are looking to support and have new alliances. I would like to give you 2, I wouldn't use the word models, but 2 examples of alliances of ISIS in the borders of Israel, which makes it a problem for Israel. The closest one is with Ansar Beit al-Maqdas. Ansar Beit al-Maqdas is the Egyptian Salafi jihadi group who already attacked Israel a few times. They have a tendency to attack in August. I don't know why it is. Most of their most horrific attacks occurred in August. Yeah, I know, it's Ramadan. And they carried out an attack against Israeli targets against Israel, basically in August 2011. Then against the Egyptians, a massive attack in 2012, which was aimed towards Israel, but they were blocked by our Air Force before they crossed in. And now they had an attack, which I'm going to elaborate a little bit about, in August 2013. This attack in 2013 was carried out by Ansar Beit al-Maqdas, led by a guy by the name of Adel Jabara. Adel Jabara was arrested in September, 1 month later. This Adel Jabara and the Egyptians now released recordings of conversation that he held with a senior officer of ISIS in Syria. Very elaborated one, made public. When you listen to the conversations, you can see an example of how close the relationships between ISIS and Ansar Beit al-Maqdas are. And in these conversations, Adel Jabara and the other guy in the Syrian side, first of all, Jabara reported, he was the one who was in charge on the attack on August 2013. When they took off the bus 25 soldiers and just executed them in the style of Daesh, but they have their own styles as well. He reported to the guy in Syria about the attack, asked him to get finance in return for this operation. He was promised to get $10,000, which is a lot of money in Sinai. He was asked by the Syrian guy to supply some Libyan forged passports to the group, because later on we find out some attempts that they were trying in Libya and to penetrate from Libya to Egypt. The guy asked, the Syrian guy demanded from our friend Jabara, Adel, to pledge alliance to Baghdadi officially and publicly. Now we have to remember that Ansar Beit al-Maqdis already pledged alliance to Zawahiri. So it gives you also some kind of competition that these two groups, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, are having. We have seen other cases where in September this year, a group of 15 ISIS members tried to penetrate Sinai from Gaza. They were caught probably for another attack. It was in July this year. They were caught before they were about to execute another attack in August. This September, 4 members of ISIS tried to penetrate Egypt in order to carry out an attack with forged passports, and they were intercepted. We had cases of people from ISIS, a member of Ansar Beit al-Maqdis, who is originally from Gaza, who was killed in ISIS in Syria. And we had more and more cases like this. So this alliance is already on the run. And I won't be surprised, I don't like to talk about the future. I won't be surprised if we see in the very near future an official announcement of Ansar Beit al-Maqdis that is cooperating with ISIS and pledging alliance to them. A different model is in Lebanon. Again, when Israel is looking at Lebanon, we have Abdallah Azam brigades. We had all kind of former Salafi jihadist group in there. Some of them already launched rockets towards Israel. In August this year, there was still going on. There was an incident where a guy who was a former member of Jabhat al-Nusra, now leading a group called Liwa al-Fajr of Islam, was arrested. Immediately, there was a reaction by ISIS people and by Jabhat al-Nusra, who took advantage of the situation. And both of them, mostly ISIS, took Lebanese soldiers as a hostage and started negotiating for releasing of their friends in jail. And up till now, they beheaded only 2 soldiers as part of negotiation. Now, it's not clear whether Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS are cooperating in this incident or whether they are just competing for power. And when we look at Lebanon and we look at the operation, the suicide attacks against Lebanon, against Hezbollah, mostly it was carried out by Jabhat al-Nusra. Some of them were carried out, few of them were carried out by ISIS and with alliances of others. Now, there is a competition of attempt to recruit groups to ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, and this competition is probably going on and will go on. When we look at the threat of Israel, to Israel, from the inside, again, I talked about the bad spirit, the negative spirit, and the inspiration that ISIS, with its successes and momentum, are projecting to other groups. In Israel, we have already seen flags of ISIS. I don't want to be as I wouldn't use the word populist, as some of our reporters that mixed, okay, it was an operative of ISIS. No, it was just a supporter. So we are going to see more and more flags, because flags of ISIS are a symbol of defiance, of identification, of loathe to the authorities, of enmity, whatever you want to call it. We haven't seen operation by ISIS. We have seen operations by Salafi jihadi elements in Israel, scattered, few, sporadic, already in the past. In Nazrat, in the Galilee, in East Jerusalem, there was one case that was unveiled by our security forces on January this year. 3 persons, 2 from East Jerusalem, 1 from Jenin, were planning an operation in Israel, and it was conducted miraculously by, allegedly, by Ayman Zawahiri, who gave the order from Pakistan to somebody in Gaza who coordinated the attack and these operatives. And according to the unveiled plot, he was intended to go to Syria to cooperate with people from ISIS, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, maybe these were the good old times, and come back to Israel. So there was one attack with a sign, or planned attack with the sign of ISIS. And there was another one that you mentioned of Namush. Again, he was attacking a Jewish target, and he was killing 2 Israelis and 2 other people. So we have already signed that international attacks against Israel, against Jewish targets as part of their plans are already there. These are the bad news. The good news is that Israel has quite many partners in this neighborhood. Some of them are vehement enemies of Israel. Even Hezbollah and Hamas, both of them are blocking or trying to block any elements from Al-Qaeda or now from ISIS, the new superpower, that will try to operate, not because they like Israel, because they don't want to lose their grip on their territory. And Hezbollah is fighting against ISIS and against Jabhat al-Nusra and against this momentum of Sunni Salafi jihadists. And Hamas will definitely, again, I usually don't use the word definitely, but definitely will try to prevent any signs of local jihadi Salafist groups, whether they identify with Al-Qaeda or ISIS in Gaza. They don't want to lose their hegemony. So in this sense, plus, of course, Egypt and Jordan are cooperating with Israel because of their mutual interest. The last sentence for you, Azani, I know that you are pressed in time.
I'm not pressing time. You have time.
Even though the last sentence.
Okay.
Israel is part of the international coalition against Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all these ilks, and all these partners. Israel has good intelligence capabilities. It has, in spite of the bitter senses in Israel about after the war in Gaza, has not bad capabilities, military capabilities. And if Israel is required to take part in this effort, whether it's in our borders, in Israel, or abroad, I think Israel will take part in this and will contribute to the blocking of ISIS. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yoram. And now, luckily, I prepare also a presentation. And this presentation will be on ISIS. So I will try to describe the evolution of ISIS to the audience here, and then we will open the stage for further discussions and other issues that connected to ISIS. I want to start with the first messages of ISIS, hijrah and jihad, meaning immigration and jihad. We try to convince you in every place around the world that you need to come to Syria or to Iraq for the jihad. This is the first and one of the strongest messages that ISIS used during the years when ISIS operated on the ground. This is one issue that I want us to understand. The second component that I want us to understand, you can see here Zarqawi and al-Baghdadi, 2 of them with a black suit, meaning the model of Muhammad during the war that Muhammad carried. 2 of them with a finger like this, the oneness of God, meaning they try to to show to their audience that they are in the field of the jihad and they are in the axis of the jihad, and this is some of the things that we need to bear in our mind. And the last component we did in this slide is the component that shows us the vision. The vision to establish the Islamic Caliphate in every places that the Muslims were during the history of Islam. And I want to start, as always, I start my discussions with the models, okay? 2 models that will give us an understanding about the way that this organization evolved. And these 2 models, one of them is the hybrid model, and the second model is the revolutionary vanguard model. let's see what is the story of the hybrid model. When you are describing a hybrid terror organization, you know that you are describing an organization like Hamas, like Hezbollah, that they have social sector, they have terror wing, and they have a political sector. Meaning they are operating within the state, within the level of the state, they are managing people, they have a political power, and they establish everything to use this political power, but they never skip the terror wing. This is one way of the organization that they operate. The second model, it's what we call it the revolutionary vanguard model, meaning a terror organization that use only the terror wing. For him, this is the time of jihad. He don't want to establish a new generation, new caliphate, and all these kinds of issues. It's a time of jihad. But even this organization evolved during the years through a process of evolution into hybrid terror model, because everybody wanted at the end of the day a political power. And this is the thing that we need to understand when it comes to the story of establishing a political power. When I just look at the terrorist organizations that are operating here on the ground, I can say that the Muslim Brotherhood evolved through the system of social sector. The Muslim Brotherhood started their operation through the social sector. But the other terrorist groups on this field, like Hezbollah and the global jihadists, they started their evolution through the revolutionary vanguard model. Hezbollah reached to a point that they are already at a hybrid terrorist organization based on hybrid terror model. Global jihadists are not there yet, but they are on this way of operation. Just take the global jihadists in a different way of thinking, and I put here the story of al-Qaeda, the evolution of al-Qaeda from the early days, 1988, until today, that model number A is based on the strategy of al-Qaeda as an organization. They published a 7-phase strategy that said that one day we will establish the caliphate. Not today, one day we will establish the caliphate. What we see in the vanguard model, that since 1988, the jihad is the most important component within the organization itself. The jihad continue after 2006-07, and the jihad continue until today. This is the element of the terror wing. What we find out during the years that since 2006 onward, the jihadists enter into the social network, what we call in our education system the dawah operation, meaning they enter into the social network because they want to capture the mind and the heart of the people and bring them under the flag of Islam and specifically radical Islam when it comes to this story. The story of the caliphate within the literatures of the global jihadists and the 7-phase strategy, the story of the caliphate was, in their eyes, will be open or established in 2016 onward. This is the story of the caliphate. In their eyes, the time is not okay yet to establish the caliphate. Let's establish it in 2016 because it's based on the strategy, the 7-phase strategy of al-Qaeda itself. So when you have the caliphate, you will be able to establish within the caliphate the political system, the social sector, and so on and so on. But during the years, in what I called here model number B, the jihadist groups in different parts around the world establish an emirate. An emirate, when they have a territory, they declare an emirate. And within the emirate, they have the ability to control over the field. So they have the three components of terror wing, social sector, and political sector within the emirate arena. What ISIS brings to this story, ISIS established the caliphate now, meaning in June 2014. Not an emirate, not something like this, a caliphate. And this caused a major debate within al-Qaeda and global jihadist circle, and we face this debate until today. Just put the story on a timeline. The first organizer of the story of ISIS or al-Qaeda in Iraq, it was Zarqawi. Zarqawi entered to this arena in 2002 and started his operations in Iraq. And in 2004, what we see very clearly that Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or Zarqawi, became an emir of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, meaning part of the Al-Qaeda component within Iraq. Although during the years, Zarqawi was not the right leader that operate based on Al-Qaeda strategy. He has his own strategy on the ground. Zarqawi died or killed by the Americans in 2006, and the next generation of the leadership between 2006 and 2010 was Omar al-Baghdadi. But this time in Iraq, would they declare an Islamic Emirate in Iraq? They declared the Islamic Emirate in Iraq, and these declarations of Islamic Emirate in Iraq caused a lot of problems and dispute and debate inside the circles of the jihadists. Because there is only one emir. Emir al-Mu'minin is only one emir when it comes to Al-Qaeda and others. This is Mullah Omar from the Taliban because he controls the state. You could not establish another emir because the level of the emir is higher than the level of Zawahiri that replaced bin Laden. But this dispute was under the radar because they don't want to put it outside the radar. But if you open the jihadi website and jihadi forums of the groups in Iraq from the early days, they said this is these days to the establishment of the Emirate in Iraq, meaning they continue the concept of this establishment of Emirate in Iraq. But we need to bear in our mind that during this time when Zarqawi was replaced, 2006 to 2010, Iraq was, United States forces were in Iraq. Al-Qaeda operation on Iraq was very bad toward the local communities, so the local Sunnite communities acted against Al-Qaeda members. So we can find out that at the beginning of 2010, when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi took the control over Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or the Islamic State in Iraq, the situation of this Islamic State was very weak. Because they were after a long campaign of United States against their forces. They were after a long campaign of the local Sunnite tribes, the awakening tribes, against their groups. And most of the Al-Qaeda leadership killed during this time. Meaning what Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi should do is what he did, he re-established again the forces of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but this time in his way. And what we can see from May 10 until today, until September 14, he established different groups. Some of them operated in Iraq, some of them operated in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra. And he take every opportunity that he can to merge groups and organizations and to recruit people and organizations from different parts around the world to Al-Qaeda rank or to the ISIS rank in Iraq and in Syria. And he has the ability to do it because nobody really in Iraq caused him a lot of trouble after he started this operation. When you see the level of the campaign, these guys, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, planned strategically to take control over the areas of the Sunnite groups in Iraq and operated also in Syria. And he used every opportunity to do it. Because after the American left Iraq, the Maliki, that was the prime minister, and people know him, his policy was toward the Shiites and against the Sunnites. So he pushed the Sunnites back to the head of the Al-Qaeda. The war in Syria opened, so you have another opportunity to carry out an operation in this field. So, and the other component is the strategic way or the strategic plan that carried out by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi to re-establish again Al-Qaeda on Iraq soil and also on Syria soil. And it's not unique and it's not new because al-Wuhayshi did it in Yemen and establishing Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula the same way that these guys did it, but without a lot of noises like we face today because the situation today is totally changed. So when it comes to the story of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, he carried out two major campaigns. One he called it Breaking the Walls, and the other he called it Soldier Harvest. And we will describe these campaigns later on. So just you can see, I took the slide of information regarding the numbers of deaths in Iraq. You see that there is a peak in 2006, 2007, and there is a low peak, and then again, we are 14 here. So the situation in the casualties in Iraq raised from the level of some hundred to the level of some thousand within some years, based on these kind of operations that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi promoted during his time. And they became an Islamic caliphate, and they established a territory, and they control a territory. And I want to describe a little bit some information about the terror campaign of this guy, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He promoted, as I mentioned before, two major strategies, two major campaigns. One started in July 2012 and ended in July 2013. He called it Breaking the Wall campaign. He accelerated through a terror attack, huge numbers of terror attacks. He accelerated the ethnic violence, meaning captured the Sunnites inside the circles of al-Qaeda. He reorganized again al-Qaeda front, and for reorganizing again al-Qaeda front, he attacked prisons. And this is a phenomenon that we saw during the last years, not only in al-Qaeda in Iraq, in al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, in al-Qaeda in other places. They attacked prison, and in Yemen also. They attacked prison and freed the al-Qaeda members and al-Qaeda leaders back again to their groups. The second campaign that he promoted, he called it Soldiers Harvest, and this campaign started in July 2013, and it was focused on the Iraqi security forces. The reason why they were enabled to take control over an area very quick, very fast, very rapid, because they, during their attack, during the year, they acted against the Iraqi security forces again and again and again, and they changed the mindset of this group in different areas in Iraq. What we can say also regarding the situation that we face today, that we have a new generation of jihadists. These are not the jihadists of Afghanistan, of the early 80s or the beginning of the 90s. It's totally different jihadist generation that are alumni of a new world that operated in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in other places around the world. And we need to find out what are the major issues that we can analyze or crystallize for these new generations of jihadists. What we face also, and it is a very problematic situation, are rapid changes. The changes very rapid. The changes are and when you can try to use and to analyze the situation on the ground, it changes. It changed dramatically, so you need to find out what other intelligence sources and way of strategic operations against these groups. And they have a huge success. When you have success, you can recruit people because everybody wants to be part of this success. And they give them this success, and they give them not a compensation only here in this world like you show, villas and all this, and pools and all these kinds of issues, divine victory, the way to a paradise. So you have also a divine compensation beside the early compensation. So success and compensation is very good. They use a brutal tactic. Why? To cause deterrence. You know, the impact of the way that they use the images on the internet cause them a lot of deterrence, bring radical to their range. So they use the media campaign, they use it very sophisticatedly and send messages to every corner around the Muslim world, motivated radicals to come to this area. The other new problem that we face is the story of national entities / states to tribes' ethnic zones. We always think in a way that we need to deal with the situation of a state. And if the state is not in a real good situation, we call them failed state. But the reality that we have here tribes, ethnic community, there is no level of the state. So you need to find out what should be your strategy towards this phenomenon, because it's totally different phenomenon. You cannot say, okay, let's stabilize Iraq, because Iraq is not a national state anymore. There are different fractions in these areas. And this is the real challenge when it comes to the story, how to deal with this kind of phenomenon. And what I can say also, when it comes to the story of ISIS, that they run a sophisticated media campaign. It's a very nice slide that was taken from Intel. They have a very good slide about the situation within an organization itself. ISIS caused a very huge dispute within Al-Qaeda. So people need to choose to whom they want to support, either ISIS or either Al-Qaeda. And what you can see here in the middle, we have Al-Qaeda Central, and still around Al-Qaeda Central, we have the most actors within this field. Al-Shabaab, Akim, Chechnya, Jabhat al-Nusra, and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And around ISIS, what we find out, groups from Libya, groups from the Maghreb, from the Sahel, and Palestinian groups. The reality is how to deal with this phenomenon, even within the areas of the global jihadists, how to change to whom should we need to support. And one of the main problems that we face today, that even within Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, that al-Wahayshi, the head of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, is nominated to be a deputy of Zawahiri, even within these circles of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, they have people that supported ISIS, meaning ISIS caused a lot of problems and dispute within Al-Qaeda circles. And I'm not saying that from the early days, Al-Qaeda was an homogenic organization, but this is one of the major crises within the Al-Qaeda circles, and really problems of competition to Al-Qaeda Central. Just to give you a clue about the way that ISIS ran the media campaign. They established immediately a lot of Twitter accounts. They established media outlets. They established media centers. They publish everything about the jihadi forums. They publish everything with digital magazine. I don't know if all of you saw the speech of al-Baghdadi in the mosque in Mosul. He was, his clothes like Muhammad when he entered Mecca. He used different issues that connected, that showed the model that I should be a Khalif one day. Meaning I'm praying, I'm lecturing, and I'm giving a ceremony in a way that people understand that I should be, or I be the Khalif. Digital magazine, Al-Qaeda, ISIS published in a very short time 3 different digital magazines. And I want you to understand something regarding digital magazine that we faced during the last years. More and more we find out that a global jihadist, it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda on the other side, publish magazine in English. Because some of their audience are English speakers. So they publish, although ISIS started this operation inside this area of Iraq and Syria lately, they have 3 different magazines. One is the major one called the Dabiq, and other magazine that gave the people information about what's going on the ground, reports and news, and they publish this kind of information every time. Just to give you a close look about the first magazine of ISIS in Iraq called Dabiq, if you see what is the most important message, the return of the Khilafah, meaning the Caliphate return. We are just trying to share with you this message that the Caliphate return, and the Caliphate return, and they even established the strategy how it returned, and we will see it later on. And here is the strategy, how the caliphate returned. This is the strategy that was published by the ISIS on their own first magazine. First, it's hijrah, meaning immigration. You immigrant from Europe, from other places, you immigrant to the theaters of jihad. When you come to the theaters of jihad, you need to operate together based on the concept of the Muslim Brotherhood, to be in a situation that you are operating together. The next component of this situation is to act against the regime, the corrupted regime, destabilize the corrupted regime. And the tamkin, the fourth stage of this, is to establish a condition that give you the ability to establish the caliphate. And I want you to understand, because the main debate today within the al-Qaeda circles or global jihadists, that is not the time to establish the caliphate. There is no all the terms that we need to establish the caliphate. There is a debate. To establish the caliphate, you need an agreement from different groups, on different audience, and well-known people within the Muslim world. What he tried to show here, I think, that there is all the terms that we need to establish the caliphate. This is the reason why Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declared himself as the caliph and called himself Caliph Ibrahim and connected himself to the Muhammad tribe, meaning I am a Qurayshi, I belong to Muhammad tribe. All these components were established and built by these guys to have the ability to run this system. As I mentioned before, when you grow up, you started to operate in the education level, trying to bring into your circle kids and influence them, so you can find out within the al-Qaeda clips, a lot of clips that connected to kids and questions and answers. They were asked kids that trying to promote them, to bring them inside Islam, inside radical Islam mindset, inside ISIS. And we always said that one of the important components of every radical jihadist is they use the dawah, the system, to bring people inside the organization itself. The next component of this discussion is the story of the jihad, meaning we are in the middle of jihad. They show clips that show that we are in the middle of jihad, and the only way to take control or to establish the caliphate is by using the jihad itself. And I cannot without another model, so I have another model for you. Those of you that are my students know that there are modus operandi of al-Qaeda. There are three different models of modus operandi of al-Qaeda. I think today we need to add another modus operandi of al-Qaeda. I call it medium intensity jihadi campaign. A medium intensity jihadi campaign saying that you are not operating with small cells, with small group, and you don't need to act against these groups that are operating on the ground. You need something else if you want to counter a medium intensity jihadi campaign. In my view, it's controlled by a theaters of jihad or central command. It can be built from united group, locally united group, some of them locally, some of them regionally, foreign fighters, because in every theater of jihad today we have a foreign fighter, local group, and they need media arm. The second component of this model is every group needs an operational room. And I'm not saying just to give you an understanding from our Western views about operational room. If you read the information from the Jihadi Forum, Jihadi website, publication of al-Nusra, Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria and other places, you will find out that they organize with operational rooms that are responsible on operation in different areas, because it's not really, as you mentioned here, it's not hierarchy, clear hierarchy of people that the order came from here, like in Hezbollah, and finish here. It's a little bit different. So we have operational rooms that are changed all the time within different arenas, and we have the media arms. What they are doing, they carried out a medium intensity jihadi operation, meaning you see all the convoys of the jihadis that run through Iraq, through Syria, and other areas. It's not small cells, it's not small network, it's not something that hide under the ground. You can see an operation, you have a target that you can operate against it. And the goal of this operation is to establish a territory, to establish a Sharia law, or to build or a caliphate or an emirate. I can say that there are three major examples that we can say that these are a medium intensity jihadi campaign. We said in the international community and even today in the Western world, we were surprised of the way that the way that ISIS evolved very rapidly, very quick, and they are operating in different areas around the world. But we face it in Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, that they took control over the tribes area. We face it in Mali by Akim, that took control over Mali by using this kind of operation. We saw it also in Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and this time we see it also by ISIS. And it's not a new phenomenon within the jihadi rank. But ISIS took it to the extreme side. This is the reason why we talk all the time ISIS, and the Islamic Caliphate, because they cause a problem even inside Al-Qaeda circles. And because the moderator don't tell me to stop, I continue. Okay, the next component, the last component that I want to describe within my discussions, these are the challenges. We face some challenges. One of them is the concept of takfir. Takfir, you know, the permission to kill somebody that he said non-Muslim. The permission of takfir, ISIS took it to the extreme side. Because for them, it's takfir against communities. It's not takfir against somebody, it's takfir against communities. If you are not like us, meaning the Salafi jihadi, or either you pay a tax, or either we kill you. In some areas, they don't want you even to pay a tax because you are not Jewish or you are not a pure Christian. This is the story that we need to understand. And they kill Muslims, not only other religion in this area. This is one issue. The second challenge is the emirate and the caliphate. You know that there is ongoing debate within Al-Qaeda circles since, I think, the 90s regarding the permission to declare an emirate. If you remember, those of you that investigate a little bit the document of bin Laden and others knew that during the years bin Laden didn't like the way that local leaders in a jihadi front declare an emirate, because it changed a little bit his position when it comes to the story of being leading Al-Qaeda issue. So we have this kind of challenge within the jihadi group. The next component that I can say very problematic when it comes to the story of the jihadists, this is field leadership and Al-Qaeda central leadership. What we find out that more and more the field leaders taking the lead over Al-Qaeda operation in different parts, even without serving the grand directive of Al-Qaeda Central, because they have the power, because today they are responsible of bringing the money for their operation, they are responsible for the recruitment, they have their own media outlet, they have their own forums, meaning they feel very strong. Why to listen to somebody that is sitting in Pakistan, Afghanistan area, and he gives us orders what to do? We can do it. This is the way that this group operates. And the last point that I raise here for maybe discussions and something like this is the story of national entities or state versus tribe ethnic zones. Because we face more and more situations that within the Middle East, North Africa, and in other places that the jihadists flourish. We are not talking about a national state. We had a problem to deal with the concept of national state. We cannot even influence them to be more democratic, using a democratic issues to deal with what happened on the ground, because there are more tribes, visions, and ethnic zones. And with this, I think I finished my presentation. Thank you very much. Yes, we open the stage for questions. We have here 6 experts. We have some questions, and then we'll get it. Okay. Yes. חברים. יש לך מיקרופון? אוקיי. ו?
אני לא שומע שום דבר.
חשוב שאנחנו נשמע.
בסדר, okay. A question for anybody on the panel here. Obviously Daesh is attracting all sorts of foreigners. Anybody want to say anything about the Uyghur Muslims in China or the Russian Muslims? What is their role? What do we know about this? Because they're clearly there. Any thoughts? Thank you.
Another question. To the Edgar. Okay.
This is a question.
Wait a minute, sorry.
Yes.
Write the question because afterwards we need to answer.
Yes, thank
They
you.
want us to answer, not just to write the question.
Yes, this is a question for Shiraz. In your research of those that are the foreigners, particularly from the UK and the EU that are traveling to Syria for jihad, and particularly those that are returning, are they first Muslims, born Muslims, or are they converts? And secondly, what is the ability to infiltrate or supervise or oversee when they return, so as to prevent activity in their original countries?
Another one. Last question for this circle, and then we answer and then continue.
We didn't talk much about, we didn't hear much about Jordan. Jordan is very vulnerable with almost 2 million refugees that came either from Iraq and from Syria. What is the situation there as far as ISIS?
Okay. You want to start with the answers? No?
China, Russia, no.
Jordan? The Middle East? No. Somebody want to answer?
China and Russia there.
Okay. It's a hard question, China.
I know as an Israeli that it's a very bad idea to volunteer. But I'll address the Chinese question, although I have very, very little knowledge of China in general. It's too huge for me. But we detect in our project the activity of the Uyghurs.
Uyghurs, yeah.
And in recent years, there was, and we have a specific project on suicide attacks that we follow. And there were several attacks, quite massive attacks in Xinjiang this year, which combined attacks with knives and suicide bombers. This group of the Uyghurs of the East Turkmenistan have belonged to the cluster of groups that operated with Al-Qaeda. Actually, the leader of this organization was part of the Shura of Al-Qaeda in the former days. So they have connections, and there were people from this group in the camps of Al-Qaeda in the good old days. Now, I haven't read about ISIS, but as I see ISIS spreading all over the world, identified by groups, I won't be surprised to find, maybe it's because it's too far that we haven't seen it and it wasn't translated to English, that there will be identification with the global jihad for me, and we'll address it later on, not now. The difference between Al-Qaeda and ISIS is not that big as we pictured. I'll address it later on if it needs to be addressed. As much as for Jordan, of course, I didn't mention Jordan, which is the strategic threat of ISIS. If ISIS or Jabhat al-Nusra or Al-Qaeda, any of them, will have an influence or even infrastructure in Jordan, maybe they have now. The Jordanians are very closely keeping up information on the public arena of what's going on. But from time to time, when we meet people who were in Jordan and have contacts with the authorities, we hear of interceptions of these kind of groups. Of course, the combination of high number of refugees from Syria, from Iraq, and the unrest, and the basic resistance of people in Ma'an and in Zarqa to the authorities, and Zarqawi came from there, is fertile ground for such operations. The Jordanians are much more efficient than the others.
Jonathan, you want? Simpson? Okay, regarding Europe.
So, with regards to whether they're converts or sort of born Muslims, overall, as far as we see, as far as we detect, the vast majority are people who are born Muslim. There aren't many converts in the Syrian conflict, at least from Europe, that we've seen. A lot of them actually weren't very practicing for a long time before they went. So they've sort of, despite having been born into Muslim families, they were pretty secular or pretty irreligious until a year or so before traveling out. In terms of surveillance, I think European intelligence agencies have been slow to react to the phenomenon of people going out there, but they certainly seem to be getting a better handle on things. The problem is scale. In the UK right now, it's believed that there are 260 returnees from the Syrian conflict. It's a huge number. And it's impossible to surveil all of them. And so pragmatic decisions are being made, given that only a handful of those people are currently arrested or awaiting trial. So decisions are having to be made at that level as to who is watched and on what terms. But I think that's the most sort of depressing or worrying aspect of all of this. It's the sheer scale of the returnees and how you begin to sift through them and to monitor them effectively.
Thank you. I just want to add two notes. As an Israeli, I must add note. So I want to add a two note regarding what's said here. Regarding the story of UK and EU, the interest, the volunteering of people, Muslims from UK to the ISIS in Iraq, it's a failure of years of strategy of de-radicalization process in Europe and in other places. Because at the end of the day, during the last years, before 2013, the atmosphere was, we have some success with the de-radicalization process. And when the Syria war started, we find out hundreds that became thousands of Muslims that came from the West to this area for being part of the jihad, meaning it was there always. The story was there always, and we think that we de-radicalize them from outside, that this is a very problematic issue to de-radicalize Muslims. We didn't do it because we see the facts today, and we are trying to prepare ourselves from the next generation that will come back from this area of operation, meaning the radicalism was there always. They just accelerated it, and it's operate. The other problem is the legislation, the system. If until today you can, in United Kingdom or in Europe, in other places, you can recruit openly people for a jihad and promoted via Twitter and other a component like this guy, Danjem Khudairi, that is operating from a United Kingdom without somebody that arrests him, put him in jail. It's because of the problems of legislation versus freedom of speech, incitement, and all these kinds of issues. We still don't have enough tools to deal with this kind of phenomenon. Regarding China and Russia, I agree with what my colleague said here. Regarding Jordan, really is a very problematic because it's one of the targets of this group, ISIS and all these groups. Next, please. A microphone.
From the United Nations. No, rather than posing questions, I would like to join this debate by sharing a couple of comments with the panel and also the audience. If you agree. Number one, that makes the panel more comfortable now, of course.
Yes, I appreciate that.
Yeah, but of course there will be appeals at the end.
Yeah.
Number one, I think just draw your attention to the fact that the Security Council of the UN is fully aware of the situation, is now busily seized with the matter. So we hope that after this conference, we'll move the analysis by the academic institutions, think tanks, government policymakers to stage 2. I think for the past few days, we have heard quite a lot of stories on the thread, where the forum by today, nice graphic pictures. Stage 2, we have to move to stage 2. Follow the Security Council, because this is the nerve of the world. That is, just tell you the story. In the beginning, it was the financing of terrorism, and then to be followed by kidnapping for ransom, CVE. But these days, this is the issue. So hopefully, you guys will continue to focus, follow the pace of the council, number one. Second, the global nature of this. I think I'm glad that my colleague just now raised one issue about Russia and China. Tell you frankly, very frankly, in the UN, we don't care about your data. These data are open sources. It's not valid, it's not reliable, it's just indicators. Intelligence will never tell you the truth. But we hope that you will continue to expand your analysis. Rather than a regional, sub-regional threat, can you make it bigger? Expand your data collection. China, Russia, Indonesia, the Philippines. So make it as an argument that is a global issue. Because there was a debate in the UN. Why this issue, the foreign terrorist fighters, became an issue. It was not an issue in the beginning. From the countries of the South, they complained against the countries from the North. Why you guys authorize free movement of the troops, or of the young people coming to the conflict zones? Now, when they're back, it's your headache, and that's why you bring it up. We tell them it's not the countries of the North. It's the countries of all the countries. But you have to tell us, you have to support this argument. That's why we need you. Number 3, stage 2 and stage 3 for your next analysis. For the next, perhaps, I think the ICT summit. Okay. I think okay, I'll continue. I think if you like, I know that you love my statements, as you did yesterday. There were many catchphrases. Crisis creates opportunity. That was, I don't know, it may be also from Sun Tzu, the strategist. The next stage, I need you guys to help us to see whether there are opportunities and possibilities. First, is there any need for a new international instrument, legal instrument on the issue of foreign terrorist fighters? That's something. We have 18 instruments that covers from kidnapping, the aviation security, maritime, everything, explosives. But this is one gap. Number 2, border control. What are the issues? I have not heard of issues of countries of origin, transit, and destination. So perhaps you should expand your analysis. Number 3, it's always a human rights issue. Yesterday we heard good analysis by one of the panelists that some of the immediate actions would be to suspend the passports, deny their travels, exclusion. My colleagues in Geneva, the human rights bodies, will never agree. Can anyone come up with good arguments to convince those policymakers? Number 4, international cooperation. I know it may be beyond your research, but there are problems among the Schengen countries, among the countries of the North with dual citizenship, Canada and Brussels. If there's one guy, one young youngster discover which nationality belongs, Canadian or Belgian. So I think the Turkish will never, perhaps I think, find it comfortable to extradite anyone because they feel they are on the weaker side when they negotiate with Europe, with its partner of Europe.
Last point.
Now, 2 more.
2 more, okay.
We have been hearing the communication strategy, how excellent, how delicate they were, our opponents. Can anyone suggest counter-narratives? Give us a list, right? This is the way to discuss the next step. Lastly, good practices. We need good practices.
Okay.
If you find them useless, give me a word. I will tell you the UN, my office, will be a helpful platform to promote those group practices.
Okay.
If you guys have good ideas, send me a mail. I invite you to New York to spend the Christmas. Thank you.
Okay. שנייה. לא חזר, we are in a panel that deal with ISIS. Yeah. Don't take it to other places. Yeah. Although we are really sitting on a very problematic barrel, okay?
Sir, with all due respect, I worked at the Pentagon on the Islamic world and on these sorts of issues for 28 years, and I retired and I don't speak for the American government. But I must tell you in all honesty, the UN only works when all of the permanent members of the Security Council agree on something, and they don't here. And so in all due respect, this is all very nice what you said, but it doesn't help. Frankly, most of the time on this, the UN has been useless. Thank you.
I want you to use a better language, okay? Wait. תן לה קודם.
Now my question is, where do you see fields? Where do you see fields of activities where basically the initiative to resolve the Syrian conflict should overlap with counterterrorism in this very complex situation in which we are at the moment? Thank you.
In regards to the supply lines, in regards to this is for the entire panel. In regards to supply lines for ISIS, there's been a lot of talk in the media about their profits from selling oil, about $3 million a day, and as well with any military needs ammunition, new weaponry, and equipment in order to fight. So considering that multiple countries that historically support terrorism, they are against, Iran, Iraq, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and in order to take over vast swaths of land and territory and continue to fight, they need to be selling oil, like $1 billion worth of oil to somebody in the world, and also receive a cache of weapons from at least a state actor in terms of quantity and supply.
Okay.
Quality, not quality.
For him.
I'd like also an explanation about the American strategy in the Middle East over the past few years, if there is a strategy. It seems that they have removed all the secular, friendly Western countries, leaders. They have produced halal, a space for a ragtag of murderous, demented people to act. They have failed now in almost absolutely every campaign. We're all awaiting today's statement that will clarify what is the strategy, perhaps. But I put it to you that we don't know in the region whether Iran, for example, is a friend or a foe anymore. Because one day there's a sanction, the other they are bringing them to solve the question of Daesh, which is in a Sunni area. I put it to you that Turkey, we don't know who allowed all these jihadis to come in through Europe. It's all Turkey, open borders. Turkey has supported and is buying the oil, and we all know that. Yet Turkey now is a friend or a foe. We don't know. Qatar. Who is Qatar if it's not this one? So basically, I say to you that the problem really is the confusing messages coming from America. Nobody knows anymore who is the friend and the foe. Against that, we have these people who are focused, murderous, but at least they know they have one single message. And the Middle East love a strong message, and these guys are providing it. And that's it.
Okay. And you count on us that we will know what is the message. Okay. Somebody want to answer? We will answer, and then we will have another round.
Two connected questions regarding Syria and to supply to... And the whole question... You see, the whole question with the ISIS is very complicated. Look at Gaza. Who provided support to Hamas during the war? Israel. Israel provided electricity and provided food to the warriors and fighters of Hamas. Who want Hamas to stay in power in Gaza? Israel. But as weak as now, we go to Syria. Who allowed Daesh or ISIS to sell the oil? Sometimes the Syrian government, sometimes because he needs oil and he needs the revenues and he needs the money. Sometimes the Kurds want to make some money, sometimes the Kurds. Who want ISIS to stay in Iraq? Now the Saudis are afraid of a possible attack on their position along the border or on Saudi soil. But they want someone to give a fight to the Iranian and the Shiites. So that's why things are so complicated. Everybody is against everybody, and at the same time, everybody is cooperating with everybody. That's part of the problem here, but clearly everybody is against the ISIS, but everybody benefit. The Syrian government, and here I'll come immediately to the first question, I mean, benefit from the existence of ISIS because people look now differently at Bashar, even people inside Syria. So it's not a bad idea to have ISIS somewhere there, not too strong, but somewhere there. The Saudis, I don't think they want ISIS to disappear. They want it back, weak, and giving fight to the Iranians and to the Syrian government or the Shiite government. That's part of the problem. Now, coming back to Syria, from the early beginning, it was clear that it will be decided not through a negotiation, but at the battlefield. And the question is very simple from the early beginning. Is Bashar part of the problem or part of the solution? Unfortunately, nowadays, I mean, maybe Syria is a lost case, and already we see two Syrians, I mean, to the east, and Bashar, if he can survive, and if he falls, probably it will not be, it will be another Libya for some time. So maybe it's already a lost case, and he can't survive for the coming years. But if he can survive, he's the only chance of the Syrians and of Syria to confront, in the long run, ISIS. That's a very serious dilemma, and you can't really fight ISIS without Bashar.
Yes, Jonathan.
Is this working? Yeah. Okay. Just with regard to two of the questions, which I had something to say on. The issue of resolving the Syrian conflict and overlap with counter-terror. In a certain sense, to reiterate what Eyal said, I mean, there is no prospect of resolving the Syrian conflict at present of any kind. We saw the farce of the various Geneva conferences, and the reason is because there is a balance of power between the various component forces in the country. But what there is, with regard to counter-terror, is there is a very obvious interest of the regime currently to present itself as the face of counter-terror within Syria. This is an obvious advantage of the regime to do that. Now, it would be disastrous, in my view, were the regime to succeed in imprinting that sense of the reality, because the reality of it is that the regime is itself part of what I regard, at least, as the most effective terror network currently active on the globe, and that is the terror network associated with the Islamic Republic of Iran. So if that ceases to be a clear understanding, this would be to the advantage of the regime and very much to the disadvantage of coherent counter-terror policy insofar as it can be brought to exist. The second question, which I'm interested in trying to respond to, is yours with regard to the issue of state actor support for ISIS. And if I can sort of paraphrase a question, I've heard it from others also, it's something like the following. Look, this entity looks to be so formidable, so powerful, so wealthy, so well organized. Surely this must mean that some kind of state actor is standing behind it. My own view is that that's not so, insofar as no coherent evidence, lots of theories of course, but no coherent evidence has emerged to suggest that there is a single state actor standing behind ISIS. I think that in its initial phase, in its fighting against the YPG militia in northern Syria, there has emerged coherent indications that the Turks, initially, in the course of 2013, were turning a blind eye to ISIS activities and maybe even were leaving the border gates open and maybe even were treating wounded fighters in Chelan Pinar. That is no longer the case. The Turks have realized this is a thing which came back and bit them already in a bomb attack in Reyhanli. So that was a moment which I think has already passed. Other than that, I want to just draw your or our attention to a number of other elements. If we look at the money that ISIS has, we should also remember the large amounts of cash that were acquired from the Mosul banking system when they entered Mosul city, but also the long-standing systems of extortion which Islamic State in Iraq has in place from businesses and from individuals in those parts of Western Iraq which it controls. Also the systems of taxation and extortion which I mentioned at the beginning, which have been put in place now for over a year in the Raqqa city. Also, you mentioned it yourself, dealing in oil, also to the regime and also across the border to Turkey, also dealing in antiquities, by the way. This is another interesting thing, which is that where ISIS controls in Syria is an area full of antiquities. So no shortage of reasons for money, and of course support from private sources in the Gulf, in Qatar, in Kuwait and elsewhere. If you put all that together, I think that that is an equally coherent explanation of ISIS. And of course, excuse me, I forgot, and also the important role of former officials of the Saddam Hussein regime, of the military and intelligence elements who are there. It's not just a bunch of crazy guys with beards running around. It's professionals in this field who, as we know under Saddam, did a very good job of repression and organization in that context. Put all that together, I think, and you get a coherent picture of why this organization is as formidable as it appears to be. And just to conclude, again, to reiterate something I said during my talk, formidableness, if that is the correct word in English, is a relative concept. And we should remember that this ISIS, this Islamic State, is not playing on the global league, on the global league of well-organized forces, right? The enemies that it is facing are the regime or government of Mamlakah, as was, the Kurdish regional government of Masoud Barzani, the regime of Bashar Assad, the Kurdish cantons in the north of Syria, and of course the ramshackle mess that some people still refer to as the Syrian rebellion. And in at least a couple of those cases, ISIS's record is not all to the positive. Against the Kurds in northern Syria, for example, its success rate is close to 0. It has not managed to make even an inch of progress into those 3 Kurdish cantons in northern Syria, which leads me, and the YPG are also not necessarily not the US Marine Corps, which leads me to conclude, and on this I'll conclude, yes, it is formidable, but it's only formidable because it's working in a particular context where most of the other actors are so very unformidable.
Emile?
Well, I'll just make a few brief comments. Look, the instability that we've seen in the last few years, responding to the question about US strategy and responding to the question about how to resolve the Syrian conflict, is partly based on an ambiguity as to what the US role in the world is. US public would say, why should we pay for the defense budgets of regional states? That's a fair question. Why should they? I mean, it's not their security problem. It's the world. They might contribute, but why should they subsidize that issue? If the US says that it will intervene, then it assumes responsibilities that others will shirk. I think there was a good argument for not intervening earlier in the Syrian conflict, frankly. However, if they should have intervened, they should have intervened early on when there was an opportunity to do so. The key point, and I agree with the criticism of your strategy. The key point is that it's ambiguous. The strategy has to be clear, and it doesn't work if there's ambiguity as to what the strategy is. You can't, on the one hand, say we are still the global hegemon and we will underwrite the security of the Middle East, and on the other hand, say we don't want to do that. So I agree with you. They need to make a choice, make that clear, and then regional players can react respondingly. So that's a fair point. And in terms of the broader macro international context, I think, this is my opinion, I think we're going to move from sort of the humanitarian era of the 1990s and last 10 years, to, which has really privileged humanitarian intervention over the value of stability, state sovereignty, with an emphasis on stability. So I don't think we're going to see the West backing rebel groups against sovereign governments in future conflicts, because we can't handle the consequences.
Yeah. Microphone. You will have private line to me afterward, not in the. Okay.
I am Italian, and we had a problem with the riot brigades about how to deal with the media. So my question is, how do you suggest the international community now to deal with the media vis-à-vis ISIS? Shall we forbid the publication of videos and so? Shall we manage in some way? In which way, eventually?
I wanted to ask a question on how deep is the strategic thinking of ISIS going? How strategic do the leaders think, if there's any strategic backing to their actions? Have they made an assessment as to their utility for challenging Israel or the IDF for provoking Israel? Or are they just kind of flying by the seat of their pants?
Oh. Hey, this guy.
Quick question. Name Moti Kahana. I've been involved with Syria in the last 4 years. A question I was from the Syrian opposition. Now the coalition finally, I read this morning, 60% support Obama, putting together a coalition to fight ISIS. If Israel will join the coalition, if Obama will decide that Assad should stay in power, mean Iran, Israel will join Iran and the Hezbollah in that fight against ISIS? That's a question.
Another question there.
Thank you. John Cochran, I work for IHS Country Risk in London. It's a point that was been mentioned twice by Jonathan. The IS dependence on former Baathists, both professional military officers in terms of their organization, but also security officials in terms of enforcing their will over areas they control, and officials. And do we have an appreciation of whether the people involved as individuals have seen the light and become Salafists from having been Baathists? Or alternatively, have these people made a marriage of convenience as a group? And if that's the case, is there room for exploiting a division because they're scarcely natural partners?
Okay, we will answer this question. Syria, please.
Okay, first of all, about the strategy of ISIS, I see a very clear, I mean, when I speak about, when I look at the military moves inside Syria, at least I see, you know, very clear strategy, very smart strategy as for picking the targets, as for, you know, how to recruit allies within the tribes and within the local population. As for the grand strategy, what next? That's, I don't have an answer. But as for they did in Syria, what they did in Syria, they achieve great success as for establishing themselves, defeating rebels and conquering military position by offering very smart strategies. So clearly they know what they are doing. As for Israel and the coalition, I think already Israel is a part of the coalition. I'm sure that any information Israeli has is being transferred and being reported to the Americans and to other Israeli allies. Anyhow, nobody expects Israel to send troops, and the Israeli public will not accept it. So it's mainly something. I mean, and once again, as for Bashar, we allow Hamas to stay in power. So the question is not whether we like Bashar or we like Hezbollah. What are the alternatives? So I think that Israel continue to do what it is doing already now.
Yoram, you want to add something?
I can speak not for Israel, but for the terrorists. I will represent them. I think for ISIS, Israeli is not the first priority, even not the second one. ISIS' priority is quite clear. They want to kill as many and to punish and to basically to eradicate the Shiites, who are perceived to be the worst apostates. Then they will deal with the strayed Sunnite who do not accept the dominance, the supremacy, if you wish, of the new caliph. Everybody who defies the caliph's order is eligible to be killed. And then, maybe, in future, they will go and avail themselves for Israel. It doesn't mean that they won't, what I call, omit, or will throw on the way attacks against Israel, because it's popular, it's raising sympathy to their cause, etc., and they will support groups, as I mentioned before. As for Nusra, Jabhat al-Nusra, again, they have their own priorities. Their pragmatism, quote unquote, so-called pragmatism that they are performing, not only vis-a-vis the local Syrians, they are focusing on Bashar al-Assad. This is their main target. And this is why they don't change position and firing towards Israel. Again, I don't count them. For me, it's almost inconceivable. Not only because of the rhetoric that Zawahiri express on their behalf, that they are going to finish the traitor Assad and they will avail themselves to attack Israel, but this is something which it's almost inevitable that they will do. So for them, either when they finish Bashar al-Assad, and if not, if there is a continuous stalemate, they may turn to Israel and try to attack Israel. Definitely, they are on the borders, and they will try to infiltrate Israel as well.
Go on.
Yeah, a couple of things. Regarding the issue of ISIS strategic thinking, I think insofar as I have observed it, ISIS is thinking strategically, and it is thinking strategically as a state, not as a global movement as yet. Of course, eventually it hopes to conquer the world and so on and so forth. But right now, it is very coherently acting as an entity which holds territory. And let me give you a brief example from my own experience, from my own reporting with regard to this. In my day job, so to speak, I'm a journalist and a reporter, and I've reported from Syria and Iraq on a number of occasions over the last 3 years. And in March, I was in northern Syria and then in southern Turkey, and myself and my fixer, a very clever man, were trying to understand an interesting thing which happened in January. And the thing that happened in January is that the global media reported that ISIS had been driven back from a number of villages by the more moderate rebels. And of course, lots of rebels were queuing up to take credit as being the ones who had defeated ISIS. But when you spoke to people on the ground in that area, what they said was hardly any fighting took place at all, as a matter of fact. And for the most part, when ISIS withdrew, it withdrew of its own accord. And we were interested in trying to find out why that might have been. And we had the opportunity in Kilis to interview a number of rank-and-file fighters of the organization who agreed to meet with me. Of course, we didn't get any joy out of them, but we got some interesting statements like, well, of course it was coordinated, and when we decide to move back, we move back, and eventually perhaps we'll move back there again. Well, in June, we discovered exactly, we and the whole world at the same time discovered exactly what this withdrawal had been about when ISIS swept into Iraq and took Mosul city. That is to say that very clearly we can now understand ISIS, in the course of the spring of this year, chose to withdraw forces and consolidate the lines of the western edge of its state in northern Syria in order to push out an offensive in the eastern edge of its state into western Iraq. This confirms the kind of thinking which the movement is capable of. It's capable of coherent movement of its forces in order to pursue the overall goal of expanding its state. And on this level, this is a deeply rational organization, much more rational, by the way, than any of the other forces engaged against the Assad regime in Syria, simply in terms of the quality of its thinking and its ability to carry out its decisions. This is firstly. Secondly, with regard to the former Baathists, yeah, there is potentially, I think, as you correctly point out, an obvious dissonance or inevitable dissonance between Salafis and Baathists, however, or former Baathists. However, I would add into the mix the issue of sectarianism, and in this case, Sunni Arab sectarianism. We don't know, or I at least certainly do not know, what the former Saddam officials within IS are thinking or saying, but we do know that one of the allies of IS, which is the Naqshbandi army in Iraq, we know what they think and say because they speak out loud, and these are former Baathists. And what they think and say is a sectarian agenda par excellence. They are convinced that Sunni Arabs, in fact, still constitute the majority of Iraq. You're probably familiar with this common idea in this camp. And they're convinced that sooner or later they are not IS, are going to lead the fight towards Baghdad to liberate the capital. So what does this tell us? This is all rather nonsensical thinking in its details. But in its base, it's very rational. What it is a sectarian Sunni Arab agenda. And in this sense, the former regime people and IS are very much on the same page.
Emile?
I just want to pick up on the question about the Baathist component of ISIS and the more general point about the extent to which we should associate ISIS with other Islamist terrorist groups. In terms of strategic thinking, Julius Caesar used to talk about divide and conquer. And when we have a very broad concept of the enemy, which rather than dividing them in terms of the things that could divide them, but aggregates them together, you replace divide and conquer with aggregate and fight forever, which is not a sensible strategic concept. So we have to distinguish between the moral position and the strategic position. Saying terror is terror is terror is a moral position, and no one can disagree with that. But it's not a sensible strategic position. It's much more sensible to find divisions amongst terrorist groups and then exploit that. The ISIS Sunni one with the Baathists being a good example. Thanks.
I just wanted to pick up on Jonathan's points to reinforce it actually on the Baathist ISIS issue. The sectarian element, I think, is probably the defining characteristic of what's taking place than the rather pragmatic alliances that have taken place. ISIS released a video shortly after they'd gone into Mosul and taken over large parts of Iraq, showing how they'd in fact reached out to a lot of these guys in hugely sectarian terms. And you know, they made reference to the awakening, for example, saying, you have the blood of our guys or of our erstwhile comrades on your hands, but we've been told to forgive you. And we've been told to forgive you because, you know, you were duped. You were duped by the United States, you were duped by the Shia, you were told that there would be a space for you in post-war Iraq and it would be okay. And that hasn't worked out. So we're going to forgive you, but the deal is you have to work with us. And that's what's propelled a lot of this. And if you speak to ordinary Iraqis on the ground, in many senses they're not that happy necessarily with the agenda of the Islamic State, but they're saying, you know, security is returning. And that's a thing when, as much as we talk about the fact that ISIS is delivering sort of social welfare and it's providing provisions to people, it's delivered security in its areas. And that's a really important factor for a lot of people as well.
Okay.
I would like to talk a little bit about the weaknesses of ISIS. think the brutality and savagery of ISIS produces sentiments of revenge. And in the Middle East where they operate, it's a very significant component which will they suffer the blowback. Second, they were skillful enough to create a vast international coalition with strange bedfellows in it. And with all due respect to ISIS, they are not a superpower. We are not talking about China or former USSR. Third, ISIS creates enemies within, from within. All al-Qaeda and its ilk and others are looking very bitterly towards ISIS, and some of them may operate against them, and some of them have already operated against them, and Jabhat al-Nusra fighting against it is quite clear. Second, concerning your question about the supply of arms, if they plan for a long fight, they need a constant supply of arms. Up till now, their main source of supply is a loot. The Iraqi and the Syrian army are the suppliers. I don't see any foreign players who is paying for them. We are hearing all the time about rich persons from the Gulf states, etc. But with this kind of war, they will need a supply, and this is a weakness that for the long run, they will have problems to fulfill. Second, or the last remark, is that the positioning, basically ISIS was getting the momentum due to the situation on the ground. 2 failed states, weak governments, and they flourished there. I'm not sure that for the long run it will happen. Syria is more complicated, but in Iraq, maybe the coalition, the recovering government of Iraq, the Kurdish fighting, the American assistance, or maybe more international, may shrink the capabilities and the control of ISIS in Iraq, and this will be the first step towards trying to solve the much more complicated, because what we have heard here, of doing it in Syria.
Yoram, I'm very happy of your optimistic end regarding putting ISIS in the right place, and I'm totally agree. There are weaknesses, and we will last comment, but less than 1 minute. Okay. We will finish with the last comment, and then we'll go out to lunch.
Thank you, Doctor. I think this is just a working group discussion. It's not the General Assembly UN discussion. But I would like to, since the UN was mentioned twice, I think, during the discussion, I would like to exercise the right of reply within 1 minute. I think the comment was that the UN should do more. Unfortunately, the UN has limitations. That's why we have to rely on member states, rely on you guys. I mean, that's the intention. The second, the UN is useless. On this, I would like to put on the record, because you have the video, you have the YouTube coming, you have the graduates and undergraduates. I don't want to have that misunderstanding there. 3 weeks ago, the Security Council adopted a resolution unanimously putting ISIS on the black list. It's the evil on the black list. It's not the Israeli list, not the American list, not the European list. It's a global list.
Excellent.
So this is where the UN is playing its role. You can tell anybody this is the evil. It's already on the UN blacklist. Second, next, what we're going to do, we'll put those who are violating the resolution of the sanctions regime, providing financial support, providing weapons, whether they are member states, entities, individuals, the UN is going to hold them responsible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to close it, and thank you for all of you.